Okay. Okay, we're up and running. Laura, do you have any introductory information before I jump into my program?
I do not. So you can just go ahead and go for it.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Ed Estes, and I'll be your instructor for this webinar. This webinar is going to go about 3 hours. We will take a short, maybe 10-minute break about halfway through. And that typically is when we finish paragraph 3 or paragraph 4. Now, I know some of you are thinking, my gosh, you're going to take a break after paragraph 3. What's going to happen with the remaining paragraphs because it goes to paragraph 31? Well, everything that's going to be negotiated, with the exception of liquidated damages and arbitration, is contained in paragraph 3. So once we get through paragraph 3, you pretty much will now know everything that is in the purchase agreement, all right? Because those are all the negotiable items. But it's a grid, it's just a checklist, essentially. What those things mean in paragraph 3 are explained in the remaining 13 pages of the document. But we go pretty fast in those remaining 13 pages. So about half this class is going to be spent on the first 3 pages. Second half of the class is going to be on the remaining 13 pages. So this is my 3rd time, I think, speaking before the Tri-Counties Association of Realtors. And I'm excited to be back here and working with Laura and giving you this information. It's worked pretty well. It is being recorded, so it will be posted on the website within a day or 2. I'm not sure how long it's going to take, but it will be there. My earlier presentation is also there, and Laura's told me it's had over 600 views. So yeah, this is exciting. What?
655.
655. So we're going real well. So what I'm going to be doing is intermittently, I'm going to be going into the chat and checking to see what's going on. And Laura has put the handouts into the chat. I've also put my email into the chat. My email will also appear at the last screen of this seminar. If you want anything, copy of the handout, copy of the contract, more than happy to provide that to you. I'm also happy to chat with you about any educational issues as they relate to C.A.R. forms, legal issues, that sort of thing. The only thing I don't do is I don't provide legal advice. So one thing I do ask, could we hold off for the chat just for questions? I know we're a very social group. We like to jump on and say hello to everybody, and that's great. But as I'm going through the document, I'm going to be jumping back into the chat, particularly if I see a lot of chats. And if it's just you greeting each other, well, I've just pulled myself away from the program. So if we could refrain from socializing in the chat, let's keep it to questions. I can get through this material a little bit faster. All right. So, okay. So thank you, Nancy. Good morning. Okay. So from now on, just questions in the chat. All right. So let's go ahead and move into the document. The way I'll be doing this is as we introduce a page, I will put the whole page up, and then we're going to go into snippets of the individual contract. So let's start again with page 1, and we'll go to the top of the page 1, and you'll see the first thing, date prepared. Doesn't really matter what date you put up there. This is just to give this contract a name. This is the purchase agreement dated December 1, 2021 between such and such buyer and such a seller. That's it. Okay. All of your time frames will go from the date of signature or the date of acceptance. Okay. So the only reason we have this is to give this contract a name, because you'll note on all of the counter offers, addenda, things of that nature, it always refers to the document it's amending or countering by its name and by its date. So that's why we have the date there. You want to put in all the names of your buyers. We'll get into this a little bit later, but this contract cannot be assigned to a different buyer without permission of the seller. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But yes, you put in all the names of your buyers and then identify the property by street address, city, county, and zip code. You'll notice below we have a very long line for assessor parcel numbers. And some of you are asking, why would we need such a long line for such a little number? Well, it's not a little number, but it's not that big, right? Well, C.A.R. is anticipating with these auxiliary, accessory, whatever you want to call it, dwelling units, these ADUs, we may be seeing more properties get split up. So we may have multiple properties on the same address, okay? So that's why we have such a long line for assessor parcel numbers. We don't know. So C.A.R. is trying to plan for the future. All right. Also, just remember, the buyer, the seller are the parties in this agreement. Brokers, agents are not parties, okay? This contract is solely between the buyer and the seller. The broker, the agents are not a party to the agreement. Okay, so agency, this is one paragraph that has not changed. So let's pretend like we're writing this contract on behalf of a buyer, okay, kind of a perspective. So if you are writing this agreement, you are going to be representing the buyer, presumably. So you'll put your broker's name where it says buyer's brokerage firm. And underneath that, where it says buyer's agent, you're going to put your individual name, and then you'll put your license numbers respectively on the right-hand side. If your company is only representing the buyer, then you will be representing the buyer only in single agency. However, if you're writing an offer on a listing that was acquired by somebody else in your company, then you're going to be in dual agency, right? You will be in dual agency. And remember, when your broker is in dual agency, you are in dual agency, okay? You have the same agency relationship as your broker. So whoever has the listing, okay, if it's a different company, you would put that broker's name there where it says seller brokerage firm, and then the individual licensee who is representing the seller, their name and their license numbers there. If you have a question on where their license number is, you can look that up on the DRE website, right? dre.ca.gov, and just find a licensee, type their name in, last name first, and up comes their name with their license number, right? All right, so that should cover our agency questions. Remember, if you're representing the buyer, you really should give that AD or agency disclosure form to the buyer before you start showing them property. That gives you the most amount of protection should somebody claim to also be representing that buyer. Doesn't create agency, but remember, you cannot become an agent of the buyer until you first disclose agency to them. So if you're out there showing a buyer property, can you call that buyer your client, or can you refer to yourself as that buyer's agent? Not unless you've disclosed agency to them. So remember, give them that AD form before you start showing them property. Likewise, under 2D, potentially competing buyers and sellers, you really should give that PRBS form to the buyer again before you start showing them property. That PRBS form will not give you any protection unless you get the buyer to sign it. And I know a lot of agents, they don't get that PRBS signed until they're in escrow. It doesn't do you any good. I know the contract says that you've given it to the buyer, but it doesn't do you any good unless you give it to the buyer before you start showing the buyer property. So remember, before you start showing the buyer property, give them the AD form, give them the PRBS form. That will help protect your commission in the transaction, all right? Okay, so moving on, we now get into the dreaded paragraph 3. This is the big change for this agreement and what makes it look different than all the earlier agreements. We've got 7 comments in the chat, so let me go into the chat and see what's there. A lot of chit chat going on, unable to open the sample.
It's just me and some of the members with the forms.
Okay,
There's no questions.
No questions. Okay, so let me go ahead and put my X's in. That lets me know how far I've gone back. So I can quickly go into the chat and here. Okay, so we got some other questions regarding commission. Let me Let me spend just a little bit of time on this and then we can get through it. Going back to the earlier page, okay, the AD form, agency disclosure. The law says that before you can claim a buyer as your client, you must disclose agency to them. Okay. Once you disclose agency, then you can create an agency relationship with your buyer. Now, typically, we create it verbally with the buyer because for some reason, people don't like to use the buyer representation agreement. Although we have a very nice class on the Tri-County's website, recorded by me, explaining the buyer representation agreement and how you can get it signed, including overcoming objections. So I encourage you to watch that class. It's like less than 90 minutes. It's a quick class. But you have to disclose agency before you can claim that buyer as your client, okay? Remember, the creation of an agency agreement with the buyer is done by an agreement, either verbal or in writing. In writing would be the buyer representation agreement. Verbal, just, you have an oral agreement. Don't really like those oral agreements, right? We like a written agreement. The PRBS form says that when buyer's ready to make an offer on a property, if you have to go into dual agency, the buyer has already agreed to do so. You don't want to have a situation where you're getting ready to write an offer, and for whatever reason, your buyer says, well, I don't want you to be a dual agent. I want you to represent only me. So now you're stuck because you can't represent that buyer if that buyer wants to make an offer on one of your company's listings, because you have to go into dual agency in that situation. Okay. So again, get that agency disclosure signed before you start showing the buyer property. Get that buyer to sign that PRBS form before you start showing the buyer property. Those forms will provide you protection in claiming an agency relationship with the buyer should you choose to do so. And if you do need to go into dual agency because the buyer wants to make an offer on one of your company's listings. All right. So hopefully I've explained that. I think we're good. All right. So now let's continue on into paragraph 3. Now, I know what's going to happen with this agreement. Most agents are only going to focus on paragraph 3, and they're going to forget about the remaining 13 pages. So you'll notice there in the terms of paragraph 3, before we get into the grid, it says this form is 16 pages. Parties are advised to read all 16 pages. So remember, contract is 16 pages. There's important terms in the remaining 13 pages. You, your buyer, your seller are responsible for understanding the entire document, not just the first 3 pages, specifically paragraph 3. Okay, so let's orient ourselves into the grid. So in that shaded area at the top, we see column 1 on the left-hand side, column 5 on the right-hand side. So column 1 is the paragraph as it relates to this agreement. 3A, B, C, D1, D2, etc. Okay. Then in the second column to the right, that is a paragraph later in the contract that is related to this section. So 3A is dealing with the purchase price, is more further explained in paragraph 5 later in the agreement. Okay. In addition, if you were to take your cursor and hover over that number 5 to the right of A, okay, it will provide a pop-up of paragraph 5 that is later in the agreement, actually in page 4. If you click on that number 5, it will actually take you to that paragraph. That's how it's supposed to work. Now, a little bit of caution. When this form is released this month sometime, at least one of those features will be there, either the pop-up or the move into the other paragraph. C.A.R. is hoping that both those features are available. If they're not, they will be available within the next month or so. okay? But that's what's coming, right? That's one of the reasons it's taking C.A.R. so long to get this contract uploaded, right? Then in the third column, we have the paragraph title, in this case, purchase price. In the fourth column, any terms and conditions. And in the fifth column, additional terms. All right. So 3A tells us our purchase price. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, the purchase price is way down in paragraph 3. Why isn't it at the top of the agreement like it normally is? Well, C.A.R. decided to put all of the negotiating items in one paragraph, with the exception of liquidated damages and arbitration. Those are later in the agreement. And since purchase price is a negotiable item, it's found in paragraph 3. So all your negotiating items here on paragraph 3, right? Let's go to 3B, close of escrow. You'll notice you can either put number of days after acceptance, which is the preferred method, or a specified date. The reason we like number of days is because you really don't know when you're going to get an acceptance. So if you're putting in 30 days or 45 days or 60 days or whatever, we measure that from the date of acceptance. We're writing this offer today on the 1st of the month. And let's say I was to put in January 15th as a specific date, but we didn't get a final acceptance because of counter offers and holiday interruptions for a couple of weeks. What happened to presumably our 45-day escrow? Well, it turned into a 30-day escrow. And the buyer really wanted a 45-day escrow. So how do we assure the buyer having a 45-day escrow? We just put 45 days after acceptance. But if you need to close by the end of the year, if you're coming out of a 1031 tax deferred exchange and you have a specific deadline, you can always put in a specific date, right? Month, day, and year. Then down to C, expiration of the offer. Like all C.A.R. agreements, it's 3 calendar days after buyer signature, okay? Or you can make it a specific day. So you can lengthen it or shorten it, however long you want the offer to be good for. Then to D1, initial deposit amount. So you'll put in your amount of deposit, and when you put that number in next to the $ in the fourth column, it'll automatically calculate what the percentage is. So you have an idea how much of a percentage the deposit is, or the loan is, or the, whatever, all right? So again, the percentage is not part of the contract in terms of its contractual obligation. It's just for calculation purposes, right? So how much deposit should you put in? Well, I always like $10,000 or less. And the reason for that is the current limit in small claims court. So that way, if there's a dispute between buyer and seller, and they're arguing over who gets the deposit, they can go into small claims court, which is what? People's court, right? Judge Wapner, Judge Brown, Judge Judy, whoever. And they can resolve that thing in about what? 45 days or so. If it's more than $10,000, then you got to go into superior court, which means you have to lawyer up. And that gets really expensive, particularly if you're looking at a deposit of, say, $15,000, $20,000. So I recommend keeping it at $10,000 or less. If, however, you have a situation where you do have to go with a larger deposit, my recommendation then is, if you're going with a bigger deposit, include the arbitration clause. That way, if there's a dispute over the deposit, rather than having to lawyer up and going into superior court, you can go into arbitration. Now, you can still get a lawyer in arbitration if you choose. But my thinking is, if you've got a buyer and or seller whose property or whose assets are significant enough, they are sophisticated enough to come in with a $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 deposit, then they are probably knowledgeable enough to go into arbitration and explain to the arbitrator why they are entitled to the deposit back, or why are they entitled to the deposit, okay, depending on if you're buyer or seller. But they can get a lawyer if they choose to. So that's my thinking on deposits, all right? So the deposit must be delivered to, okay, escrow within 3 business days by wire transfer after acceptance. This is the only time in the contract we will see business days. How long does it take to get the deposit to escrow after acceptance? 3 business days. The reason for business days is escrow is not open on non-business days, right? So we use business days for the amount of time to get the deposit, the initial deposit to escrow. Everywhere else in this agreement, we will be using calendar days, okay? So the only time we use business days is for that initial deposit going to escrow. Now, D2, okay, is the increase of deposit. So in column 3, if you want to increase the deposit, you check the box there, okay? And that increase of deposit will be delivered, okay, upon the removal of all contingencies. We see that in column 5. So when does the increase of deposit come into escrow? When all contingencies are removed. Okay, so that's how the language is. Can you change that? Yes, you can. Do I recommend using the increase of deposit at all? No. The challenge with increase of deposit, it creates more work for you. And if it creates more work for you, the agent in the transaction, it also increases your liability. So why increase your liability? My suggestion is just go with an initial deposit. Remember that if you are going to be doing an increase of deposit, when that increase of deposit comes into escrow, you need to give the buyer the DID form, okay? Delivery of increase of deposit. Failure to deliver to the buyer that DID form is going to make that increase of deposit not applicable for liquidated damages if the liquidated damages clause is included. We'll get to that later in the agreement, all right? DID form, you're probably not familiar with that. That's because currently it's the RID form, right? But it's not really a receipt for increased deposit because you're not normally there when the deposit comes in. So that's why C.A.R. is changing the name to DID. It is now the delivery of increase of deposit, right? Going down to E1, okay, the loan amount, okay? So we have the first loan, we put in the amount, which will automatically calculate what percentage that is of the purchase price. The default language says it will be fixed rate with 0 points, okay? And this loan amount, okay, well, let me just stop right there. If your buyer is paying points, you will need to put that in, okay? If your buyer is going with an adjustable rate, you need to put that in. And the default language is that it's going to be a conventional loan. If you're going with a government loan, FHA or VA, or if you're going with seller financing, then you need to check the corresponding box in column 5. Remember, presenting an offer, telling the seller you're going in with a conventional loan, and then shifting over to a government loan, either FHA or VA, may be viewed as a misrepresentation of a material fact. So please do not write an offer without checking that FHA or VA box if your buyer is going either FHA or VA, right? If you check that FHA or VA box, then the HID form will automatically attach. That HID form is essentially a disclosure form letting the parties know that if you've got a government loan, okay, that deposit cannot be used for liquidated damages, okay, until the property appraises for the purchase price, okay? So just FYI, you cannot create a situation where the deposit is going to be at risk or non-refundable, okay, by including the liquidated damages clause with an FHA or V loan. It's federal law, okay? You can't get around it. It's federal law. You cannot waive that statute. Okay? With an FHA or VA, you often have a situation with the lender where repairs must be done with the property. With VA, closing costs paid by the seller. Okay, that will be delivered to the seller within 17 days after acceptance. And rather than the currently used the FVA form, under this new agreement, we're going to be using a request for repairs. So the request for repairs form that you're currently using is going to get changed to allow the request for repairs form to be used for VA and FHA buyers to request seller to do repairs required by the lender, to request the seller to pay fees required by the lender under a VA. So just remember that FVA form is going away and new language is going to be added to the request for repairs form, because that FVA form, for those of you who deal with government loans, VA and FHA, was essentially a request for repairs form anyway. So C.A.R. has just combined the two, right? E2 is for any secondary financing that we might have. Terms are very similar. And then we have a new situation down on E3, and this has to do with the occupancy type. The default language is primary. If it is a secondary home, which would probably qualify as a vacation home, you would check that corresponding box. Or if it's investment property, you would corner the box for investment property. Why do we have these differences? It's really more of a lender thing. Lenders will typically charge a higher interest rate on a secondary residence because it's considered riskier. And not only do they raise the interest rate for investment property, but they'll probably require a larger down payment. Okay, so anyway, just more of a disclosure to the lender what's going on now in E3. And then F, balance of down payment. Of course, this is already going to add up for you, just like it does in the current agreement, and you'll have your purchase price at the bottom, right? So I think I've covered the first section of paragraph 3. We've got something in the chat. Let me see what's here. Do holidays like Christmas count as calendar days? Yes, they do. How does a holiday affect contingency deadlines? Holidays will not affect contingency deadlines unless the last day to perform falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. And if it does, then you just roll to the next business day. Put yourself in the mind of, say, a lender who is maybe the seller on a real estate owned REO property they took back for foreclosure, or maybe some other corporate entity that's not open on a Saturday or Sunday or holiday. Can they perform on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday? And the answer is no, they can't. So if a deadline occurs on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, we're just going to roll over to the next business day. Okay, so that's how, but we still count calendar days, right? We still count calendar days. So if you give somebody something on a Thursday, Friday is day 1, Saturday is day 2, Sunday is day 3. If there's a 3-day deadline, then the third day would roll over to Monday. Okay, but we do count calendar days all the way through. It's only if the last day falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday do we roll to the next business day. All right. Okay, nothing else in the chat, so I can move on to page 2. Excuse me for a second. Sorry about that. Sometimes my nose clogs up a little bit as I talk too much. So now we're at the top of page 2 in subparagraph G and seller credits. So if the seller is providing a credit to buyer, the default language says it will be used for closing costs. They're in column 5. If you want to use it for something else, you can put that in column 5. And then you put the amount of credit, which will automatically calculate to the percentage of purchase price. Now, you'll notice if you were in column 5 and you wanted to use it for something else, can't think off the top of my head what you might be using it for, but let's say it was something other than closing costs, you would check that box and write it into the blank. Now, you'll notice that's not a very long blank. This is something this contract is going to do. As you stop typing stuff in there, if the number of characters you are putting in that space exceeds the amount of room then a new addendum form will automatically attach called the TOP. And your language will, or your information will be in that TOP. Now, if you go into zip forms and look for the TOP, you won't find it. The only way it'll appear is if you exceed the space for characters in this contract. So it's kind of like the secret hidden addendum that only pops up if you exceed the number of characters in the room provided. All right. We will still have the C.A.R. addendum page, so that's not going away. So if you want to pull up the addendum page, you will always have that. G, for any additional finance terms. Now, you remember in the current agreement, we usually put seller to credit for closing costs and the additional finance terms, but people still like additional finance terms. So C.A.R. has provided that to you. And now under H1 and 2, we've got some new stuff here. A little bit of consistency into what we currently have in the current purchase agreement. So in the current purchase agreement, or shall we call it the old purchase agreement, since we're now in December, if you have an all cash offer and you check the all cash box, you're supposed to provide proof of funds. In the current agreement, your verification of down payment and your verification of loan application, okay, is to be given in 3 days after acceptance, unless you check the box. Then it accompanies the offer. They're inconsistent. One does it one way, one does it the other way. That doesn't make any sense. So what C.A.R. has done is it made it consistent. So now, if you have an all cash offer, okay, so we go back to page 1, paragraph 3, subparagraph A, right-hand side, okay, column 5, all cash. So if we have an all cash offer, then you will accompany this offer with proof that the buyer has the cash. Okay? Or in column 4, you will check the box and the buyer has 3 days to present to the seller proof that they have the cash. Okay. H2, okay, verification of down payment closing costs. That will also, if you have a buyer who's getting a loan, that will accompany this offer. If you're not accompanying verification of down payment and closing costs with the offer, you need to check that box. Buyer has 3 days to present that to the seller. Okay. Or you can make it a different time period. It's 3 days, or you can put in a blank there. Here's a new one. Verification of loan application down in H3. Again, attached with the offer. If you don't have it, then you check the box, 3 days to present. These are all calendar days. Now, in column 5, under H3, you find 3 boxes: pre-qualification, pre-approval, and fully underwritten pre-approval. What's the difference? Well, there are no set definitions. In later versions of this form, C.A.R. may come up with definitions for these, but I can give you my definition, and C.A.R. agrees with my definition. So if C.A.R. agrees with me and I agree with C.A.R., well, it's good enough for me. Hopefully it's good enough for you. So what is pre-qualification? Pre-qualification is your buyer has verbally talked to a lender. The lender has run their credit. So they got their Social Security, they've run their credit. Your buyer and lender, your lender has taken a verbal from the buyer of how much money they make, okay, how much they owe, and how much money they have in the bank. All right. So those are your 3, right? Credit, capital. I always have a problem with the C's. Your credit, your income, and your assets in the bank. All right. So but it's all verbal. Okay. Hasn't been verified. That's pre-qualification. And based on that information, the lender will give the loan. Pre-approval is the lender has actually gotten written confirmation. So they've actually looked at their last 2 years of tax returns. They've looked at their W-2s. They've seen their credit card statements. They've seen their bank statements. And based on that, they've approved the loan. Okay, that's pre-approval. What's this new one? Fully underwritten pre-approval. What that means is this loan application has actually gone through the underwriting process. And the lender has said, we can do this loan. The only thing we're waiting on is the appraisal. If this property appraises for this purchase price, done deal, we're ready to go. Why do they create this new category? They created this new category so that your buyer who needs to get a financing can now compete against an all cash buyer. Because even the all cash buyer has an appraisal contingency, right, in this contract. So the thinking is we want to give a buyer who needs financing the same strength as the all cash buyer, and to do that, fully underwritten pre-approval. Now, do lenders know about this new category? I'm not sure they do. Some might, some may not. Okay, so this is going to be an education process for our lenders. We may have some lenders in this class right now, but that's what that fully underwritten pre-approval is supposed to do. Okay, we'll see how it works out. Now, you notice 3I is intentionally left blank. You're probably wondering, why is that? Well, because 3I looks a lot like 31. And you'll see later in this paragraph, 3O has also been eliminated because 3O looks a lot like paragraph 30. So to avoid confusion, they just left 3I and 3O blank. So it'll be less confusion, right? Going down to J, final verification of loan condition. Final verification of condition. This is the final walkthrough, 5 days prior to close of escrow, just like we have in the current contract. And then something new, K, assignment request. So if your buyer is thinking of assigning their rights to a different buyer in escrow, right? They must make that request to the seller within 17 days after acceptance. So the current version of the contract does not allow assignment without seller's approval. It goes on to say seller's approval will not be unreasonably denied. This paragraph or this contract takes it a little further. It says that if the buyer wants to assign, then they must make that request to seller within 17 days after acceptance. If they make that request later than that, and we find this language in paragraph 23, you'll notice down at K, second column, it refers to paragraph 23. In paragraph 23, it says that if the buyer makes the request after 17 days, then seller's refusal to approve or denial of the assignment is not considered unreasonable. Okay? So buyer's going to need to make that request to the seller within 17 days. It goes on to say that buyer must also disclose to seller if buyer's being paid by the assignee to send the assignment over to that third party. All right? One other point, if the buyer is assigning or transferring to their trust or a corporation or an LLC that they are the sole owner, that doesn't require seller approval. Because if you're buying a property, but you're going to put title in your own living trust or an LLC or a corporation and you're the sole owner, you're basically just transferring it to yourself, just in the name of a different entity. Okay, so we'll talk about this more when we get into paragraph 23 if you have any further questions, but I kind of want to let you know what's coming at you. All right, so we've got some things in the chat. Let me go up here. Let's see. Yes, credit capacity. I knew someone would get you. Credit capacity and collateral. I always lose one of those. I get the credit right, It's the capacity and the collateral. I just don't remember the C's very well. How about conditional pre-approval? We don't have conditional pre-approval. I would assume pre-approval is now conditional pre-approval. Pre-qualification, you're just taking somebody's word for it. The big one there, fully underwritten pre-approval. That means this buyer can qualify for the loan. This buyer is getting the loan as long as the property appraises. So the only thing you're waiting on is the appraisal. All right. How do we counter K23? Well, if you're a seller and you don't want to allow the assignment, you could just put in the counter offer, buyer cannot assign to a third party, paragraph 23 deleted, I guess. But you see, the seller already has the right to deny the assignment as long as it's considered reasonable. I'm not sure why the seller would object to the assignment unless they feel that the buyer is getting too much money for the assignment and maybe the seller has underpriced it. But then really the seller's action would be against their agent for allowing the property to be underpriced. All right. Use the seller, well, not the seller multiple counter offer, you'd use the seller counter offer. Okay, you only use the seller multiple counter if you're countering to multiple buyers, and you wouldn't necessarily have multiple buyers at this point. There are banks like East West that refuse to issue pre-qual letters. How would we handle this for H3? Don't use East West Bank, I'm afraid. This is going to be something new for our lenders, and maybe our institutional lenders will not be able to pivot and provide this fully underwritten pre-approval letter as our mortgage bankers and our mortgage brokers do. I don't know, but please don't crucify me right now. Remember, I don't work for C.A.R. I'm just a realtor, I'm an affiliate, I'm a teacher, okay? But when you get into where C.A.R. is coming from, it makes some sense to have this super level of pre-qualification or pre-approval so that you can compete against an all-cash buyer. Because I know if you're out there trying to get a loan and buy a property, going against an all-cash buyer is really tough, right? In terms of, I mean, the sellers are going to want to go with that all-cash buyer, right? So that's what this fully underwritten pre-approval is designed to do. And maybe lenders don't want to do it. Maybe lenders balk at it. But again, if your buyer is going to be competitive, they may want to look at a different lender. Okay, we'll see how this plays out. Nobody really knows. Okay, clients are allowed to choose which bank they want to work with. Absolutely, your buyer gets to pick their lender. Okay, it is not appropriate for the seller to insist that the buyer use their lender. It may be appropriate for the seller to insist that the buyer gets pre-qualified, okay, by a second lender, because we know some lenders are not real good at pre-qualifying. Okay, but for a seller to insist that a buyer use a specific lender, that's not appropriate, and that could raise a RESPA violation with the seller's agent. All right, we can talk more about that after the class if you have some questions on that. All right, so let me, let's see, I think I've covered this. Let me go to the next paragraph, if I can. Paragraph L. Now, this is one of the things I really like about this new agreement, the way they've listed out the contingencies. Our first two contingencies, L1 and L2, are the loan and the appraisal. These are the only two contingencies that can be released with this offer. And you'll see that there in column 5 by checking the boxes, okay? No loan contingency, no appraisal contingencies, then those contingencies are released. But you'll notice removal appraisal contingency does not eliminate the appraisal cancellation rights in the FVAC. So remember earlier I talked about trying to release the deposit, okay, or making the deposit non-refundable with the release of contingencies and that kind of thing, not with a VA or an FHA offer, okay? Because with a VA or an FHA offer, you always have buyer's right to cancel based on the appraisal. You cannot release the appraisal contingency, okay? You just can't do it. So that deposit is always going to be refundable, even if the liquidated damages clause is initialed with a VA or FHA offer until the appraisal comes in and it appraises at the purchase price. Okay, so just FYI on that. Now, in column 3 of L2, you'll see that the appraisal contingency is based on the appraised value. Sometimes we see offers where they will allow the buyer to make up the difference between the purchase price and the appraised value. So if you want to lower the threshold of what the property needs to appraise at, you write in an offer on an $800,000 home, but you'll be happy if the appraisal comes in at $700,000 and you'll pay the $100,000 difference. You can do that in column 3. In my example, by writing $700,000 in that blank there in column 3 for L2, okay? Not that you necessarily would want to do that. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could. Okay, so L1, L2, appraisal and loan contingencies can be released with or released in this offer. If you want to remove any other contingencies, now we go down to L3 through L7, okay? You need to attach the contingency removal form, okay? So these contingencies must be released with an addendum. So under L3, investigation of the property, all right? 17 days, okay? Then informational access to the property, also 17 days, okay? But that is not a contingency. So the buyer has the absolute right to walk through the property, look around, measure for furniture, compare paint samples, against the wall, okay? They have the right to do that during the first 17 days. That's not a contingency. But the investigation of the property, that can be removed. That is a contingency, all right? Now, one other thing about contingencies before we get too deep into them, it's very important that you focus on the specific contingency at issue, okay? The loan contingency is to allow the buyer to get out of it, the contract, if they don't qualify for the loan, which means they don't have enough credit, collateral. Always miss the last C. You know what I'm talking about, okay? Don't have enough assets, don't have enough income, don't have enough credit, okay? That is loan. Appraisal contingency, the appraiser says the property is not worth what the purchase price is, right? That's the appraisal contingency. What if the buyer can't get hazard insurance because the seller has made too many claims, right? And then they can't get the loan. Is that the loan contingency? No, that's the investigation of the property contingency, okay? Researching the availability of hazard insurance, fire insurance, that's part of the investigation of the property. That's not the loan contingency, okay? So again, very important that you note which contingency contains what, all right? L4, review of seller documents. 17 days after acceptance or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. Now, this is nothing new. This is what we have in the current contract. So seller is going to give all disclosures to the buyer within 7 days of acceptance. What if seller gives a late disclosure? They don't get the TDS to the buyer until 10 days after acceptance. What happens? Well, 10 days plus 5 days is 15 days. which is longer, 15 days, 17 days, 17 days. Okay, so we're still within the 17-day contingency period. What if the seller gives the TDS to the buyer on day 15? Well, 15 plus 5 is day 20. So the buyer would have 20 days after acceptance for this contingency. So the contingency is 17 days, okay, after acceptance, or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later, okay? You will always have at least 17 days, but for a later contingency, it's 5 day, or excuse me, a late delivery, it's 5 days after that late delivery, whichever is later, the 17 days or the 5 days after the late delivery. Okay, so that's how that works. L, review of the preliminary title report, again, 17 days or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. Common interest disclosures, again, 17 days or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. And then review of leased and liened items. Again, these solar panels, double pane windows, commonly financed with these PACE or HERO loans. Remember, they're a super lien and it creates some challenges. Buyer has 17 days after acceptance to review those, or for a late delivery, 5 additional days, whichever is later. All right. If you have a situation where the buyer needs to sell their property first before they can buy this property, then you're going to attach that COP form. You would check the box there in L8, and then you would follow the instructions on the COP form. Which reminds me, if you haven't looked at the COP form in the last year, take a look at it. They added another half a page, right? It's not a 1-page document now, it's a 2-page document. It's a little tough to read, okay? My recommendation is sit down sometime, read it as if you were a buyer, okay? Read it as if you were a buyer and you need to sell your old property first before you can buy this property. It makes it a little easier to understand if you come at it from that mindset, right? We have 5 things in the chat. So let me jump into the chat and see. Okay, loan contingency used to be 21 days. Why do they shorten it to 17 days? Very good question, Larry. I think the reason they shortened it is for consistency under the current agreement or the old agreement, okay? If you were going to give a notice to perform, remember you can give the notice to perform 2 days early. So you would give it on day 15 for the 17-day contingencies, would be investigation and appraisal. But then you would give it on the 19th day for the 21-day loan contingency. So you're having to give 2 of those notices to perform. So they changed to 17 days. Now you're coming in and saying, well, wait a minute, that doesn't give me a lot of time with the loan like I had before. But remember when we talked about pre-qualification, pre-approval, and fully underwritten approval? This contract is now written that your buyer has already gone through part of the loan qualifying process. They've already met with the lender and they have either pre-qual, pre-approval, or fully underwritten approval. So what we're trying to do is get that buyer qualified for the property they're making an offer on. And again, for those of you who've been in the business a while, you know, if you want to have a realistic expectation of getting this buyer to buy a property, you really do need to get them sitting with the lender before you start showing properties, or at least on the phone with the lender, before you start showing them properties, because otherwise you don't know what they can afford, right? And the worst thing you can do is show a buyer a property that they can't afford, because now you're not going to be able to show them anything they want because they want the property they couldn't afford, right? So again, contract's been changed. The mindset of the contract has been changed, that we're only going to be showing properties to buyers who are pre-approved or pre-qualified, all right? If appraisal is 17 days and loan is 17-day removal, can either of these be changed by writing the offer? Of course, of course. And if we go back in here, you'll notice up in L1 and L2, in column 4, it's 17 or blank days. So you can make it longer or shorter. Remember, if you make it longer, your offer is not going to be as attractive to the seller. If you make it shorter, you might be impairing the buyer's ability to get that information. I don't know how long it's taking you guys to get that appraiser out and appraise that property and get that appraisal back. Sometimes you can get it back in 12, 15 days. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. So, I mean, that's the issue. And it's going to depend on the market and the availability of appraisers out there, right? Okay, so let me keep going. I think I had one more question in the chat. Does the city of Los Angeles, okay, well, okay. Okay, I believe Ed was just saying about the buyer's offer would have a better chance of acceptance with a bank that would approve, provide an approval letter. Absolutely. I mean, I think you can see if you're coming against me, I have a buyer and you have a buyer, okay? And my buyer has gone through fully underwritten pre-approval, okay? They have fully underwritten approval. The bank is saying, or the lender is saying, the only thing we're waiting on is the appraisal. This buyer's good. We're ready to do the loan. But your buyer hasn't even met with the lender yet. How do you think the seller's going to look at our offers? They're going to go with my buyer, more likely, right? Likewise, if you got a cash offer over here, that's tough to compete against. But my buyer with fully underwritten pre-approval, okay, may be able to compete with that all cash buyer if I'm offering a higher price. Okay, that's kind of where we're coming through. Does the City of Los Angeles 9A form fall under the seller document contingency or investigation of property contingency? Listen, I'm not familiar with the City of Los Angeles 9A form. I'm sorry. So I can't answer that question. I apologize. Okay. All right. So excuse me for a second. Went swimming in the pool this morning and chlorine is making me sniffle a little bit. All right, so let's go to the next section. Paragraph M, possession. So time of possession will be upon notice of recording. Okay. A little careful because typically we get that notice around 11, 12 o'clock, maybe 1 o'clock. Seller's supposed to be out of the property by then, okay? Or you can make it 6 p.m., okay? So it's at the end of the day. Or you can make it a different time, okay? Now, if you make it a different time, we might be in a situation where the seller is going to remain in the property after close of escrow. And that's where that TOPA comes in. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, all right? M2, seller occupied or vacant units, okay? Again, at close of escrow. However, if we want the seller or want to allow the seller to stay in after close of escrow, we need to determine what time frame are we looking at. Do we have 29 days or fewer? That's the first box, okay? Then we go with the SIP attachment, seller in possession. So you can put in that first box in column 4, okay? X amount of days. Normally it's what? 3 days, right? COE plus 3, a little bit more time for the seller to move out. You know, if you're writing an offer on a property and let's say the sellers are old, right? They're in their 80s. They don't like change. They don't like uncertainty. They want a little bit more time to move out. And sometimes you can get the property at a better price if you're willing to give them 3 more days to move out, right? Because at that stage of their life, convenience is more important than money. And they can really appreciate those 3 days. So in that case, you're going to use the SIP form, seller in possession, 29 days or fewer. So whatever days you put in the box there, just that first one is for periods of 29 days or fewer. The box below that, 30 or more days. If you've got 30 or more days that the seller is going to stay in the property, then you will attach the RLAS form. And again, these forms should automatically attach depending on which box you check. So what's the difference between the SIP and the RLAS? Well, you're creating a tenancy either way. It's just that if it's less than 30 days, I like to call it a minor tenancy, right? But if it's 30 days or longer, now issues of deposit, payment of rent, these things come up, which are addressed in the RLAS, residential lease after sale. All right. So again, depending on the situation, you have two different agreements between the parties for this tenancy that's being created. Remember, that could create an issue with insurance and the loan. So the buyers need to talk to the lender and their insurance company. They may need to get a rider on their insurance. Close of escrow +3, usually not a problem. But if you've got a seller who's going to stay in the property for longer than 30 days, that's really turning into an income property. So that may cause some problems with insurance and with your lender. Okay, so that's something the buyer needs to talk about with their lender and their insurance carrier. M3 for tenant occupied units. So if it's tenant occupied, you check the box there in column 3, and then note in column 4, the TOPA is going to be attached. Now, currently, under the current or soon to be old agreement, the agreement says that if the buyer is going to reside in the property as their primary residence, okay, which the default language of this contract provides for, then the buyer must be out 5 days prior to close. What the TOPA says is I got that wrong. If it's a tenant occupied property, okay, and under the current agreement, the tenant will be out 5 days prior to close. Why 5 days? Well, that's the period for the final walkthrough, right? The verification of condition. When you do the final walkthrough, you want to make sure the tenant's out. What the TOPA says is the tenant will remain in the property unless you check the box. So there's a box in paragraph 1 of the TOPA. Now, please don't run over to zip forms and try to find the TOPA because it's not there yet. It will pop up when this new purchase agreement comes up. Okay? What the new TOPA is going to say is the tenant remains in the property unless you check the box. If you check the box, then the tenant is supposed to be out 5 days prior to close, like we have in the current agreement. Right? However, if the tenant is not out 5 days prior to close, so the buyer gets ready to do their final walkthrough on 4 days before close or 3 days before close, and the tenant's still in the property, and the tenant says, I'm not moving. Now the buyer has a choice. They can either go ahead and buy the property and waive all rights against the seller for not getting the tenant out, or they can cancel escrow. They were entitled to get their deposit back, plus any appraisal fees that they paid and property inspection fees that they paid by the seller. So the seller will have to reimburse their deposit, even if they waived all contingencies and initial the liquidated damages clause. Okay. The seller must reimburse them for their appraisal fee. The seller must reimburse them for all property inspection fees. But that's it. Buyer waives all other rights against the seller for breach of the contract because the seller is supposed to get the tenant out. So C.A.R. had to make a call here. They either made a decision that we're going to fall on the seller side or the buyer side, and they chose to fall on the seller side, acknowledging the fact that it is difficult to get tenants out of properties these days. One good thing about most rent control ordinances, I say most, okay, including the statewide rent control ordinance or statute, and most COVID prohibitions of an eviction, is there are two exceptions. Two exceptions are typically if the property owner wants to go out of business, or if the property owner wants to occupy the property as their residence, you can evict the tenant. And you may have to pay relocation fees, but those are the two exceptions that are contained in most rent control ordinance. Remember I said most. And if a seller is selling the property to a buyer who wants to live in the property, then those two exceptions kick in, okay? But even saying that, it's still hard to get tenants out of a property, okay? So that's why we have this language here. Now, I have looked at that TOP. I know I'm going to get TOPA, excuse me. I know I'm going to get some people say, how do we change it? You change it by hiring an attorney to draft your own addendum, okay? That TOPA form is tightly written, okay? Don't you try to change it on your own. You need an attorney to go in there and change it, okay? Have an attorney prepare an addendum for you, okay? But that's how it reads. If any of you want to see a copy of the TOPA, you can email me after this class. Happy to send you a draft form, okay? estes@mountsac.edu. Or you can just Google me. I'm all over the internet, okay? If any of you want to join me on LinkedIn, join me on LinkedIn. You get all kinds of stuff that I put out there, right? Okay, moving down into N, okay? Documents and fees of compliance. Remember, the seller delivery of documents there, and 7 days after acceptance, just as we have in the current agreement, okay? Parties are supposed to sign and return escrow instructions back to escrow 5 days after receipt, just as we currently have in the purchase agreement, okay? Time to deliver, or some time to pay fees ordering HOA documents by the seller, okay? 3 days after acceptance, okay? Just like we currently have, right? Here's something new. Installation of smoke alarms, CO detectors, and water heater bracing, okay? 7 days after acceptance. Now, later in this paragraph, we're going to see who pays for this, okay? But right now, the contract says the seller is responsible for making sure that there are smoke alarms, CO detectors, and water heater bracing in this property. First of all, it's the current law, okay? You are looking at a $100 fine. Wow. But a $100 fine if the house you live in does not have a smoke alarm, does not have a CO detector, and the water heater is not braced. So that's just current law. It's not a point of sale requirement. So sellers required to have those things done. Now, who pays for them can be negotiated under the cost section in paragraph 3, and we will get to that. But that's what's in there right now, okay? And the reason this is important is later in the agreement, it says that if somebody comes out like the appraiser, and when they're appraising the property, they can't find the smoke alarm or the CO detector, or the water heater isn't braced, which means they're going to have to come out a second time to finish that appraisal. Many of us have been there, right? Then the seller's responsible for the cost of that second visit, that second inspection, okay? That's why it's important. So seller needs to make sure these things are installed. Who pays for them can be negotiated later in this paragraph, but seller is still required to make sure they're installed, all right? Mentioned earlier why paragraph 3.0 is left blank. Now we go into paragraph 3. I seem to have been doing a pretty good job. Nothing in the chat, so we'll move on forward. P1, all items to be included. Now in paragraph 9, we have that boilerplate language, which lists all the things that are to be included. These are things that are typically negotiable as whether they will or will not be included. So if the buyer wants any of these items, and I always recommend they check the box for stove, because I don't want seller removing the stove, right? But check that box. You'll notice that the bathroom mirrors are included. I guess we have a problem with sellers taking the bathroom mirrors out. Bathroom mirrors have to be included. But if you want any of these other items, check the box. If there's a built-in microwave in the property, I recommend you check the box for microwave. Same thing for dishwasher. And then if any items are going to be excluded. So again, it's always a good idea representing the buyer. Look at that MLS comments, look at those confidential remarks, see if the listing agent has put anything in there that are supposed to be included or excluded, and then make sure you repeat them here. You can't go off the MLS for things included and included. We'll talk about that more when we get to paragraph 9. So make sure you repeat that here, either in P1 or P2. And now we get to paragraph 3Q, which is a huge paragraph. And this is, as I talked about earlier, the allocation of costs. Okay, so Q1, who's going to pay for natural hazard disclosure? Okay, and then in column 4, you can check either buyer or seller. Now above that in the shaded area, you see that it says, if both is checked, they will be split equally between the parties. Right? So typically, for you new agents, the seller pays the cost for an NHD, natural hazard disclosure. If you want additional items added to that NHD, you can list those there in column 5. Q2, Q3, any other reports that you might want to do. So if you want a roof inspection, if you want the seller to pay for a termite inspection, you can put those there and ask the seller to pay for it. I wouldn't recommend listing anything that the buyer is going to pay for, because the buyer can always pay for it, right? But if you list something down and say the buyer's going to pay for it, the lender may add it to a loan condition, and you don't want that. Okay. Now remember, this is only for the inspection reports. Who's going to perform any work needs to be done on a request for repairs. So I know in a contract 10 years ago, right? We had the provision where you could ask the seller to pay for section 1 work, or section 1 and section 2 work in a termite report, right? The problem was you're asking the seller to pay for work. Well, first of all, you don't even know if the work is required because you haven't done an inspection yet. And then secondly, you don't know how much it's going to cost. And I've actually seen section 1 work at $38,000 in one report and $42,000 in another report, subterranean termites that had gotten into load-bearing walls. Very expensive. So having a seller or requiring a seller to do work where you don't know how much it's going to cost can come back and bite the agent because they didn't properly advise the seller of the risk that the seller was getting into. So that is definitely not advisable. All right. Q4, who's going to pay for the installation of those smoke alarms, CO detectors, and water heater bracing, right? So the seller has to put them in, okay, within 7 days. Who pays for them can be negotiated here. If I'm writing this offer, I would ask the seller to pay for it, okay, because the property is supposed to have those anyway. If there's any government required point of sale inspections or required remedial actions, what might that be? Well, you may have a local ordinance requiring low flow water fixtures, low flow toilets, right? Because of the drought. That may pop up as a local city requirement. And the reason the city found out about it is because they do a point of sale inspection. Some of our cities do that, okay? I usually check the sellers down there, but again, it's a negotiated item, right? Escrow fees, this is kind of a funny one, Q7. Buyer, seller, both, or each to pay their own. What's this going on? Well, both, what does that mean? You see, there's actually typically 2 escrows in a transaction. You've got the sale escrow, transferring title from the seller to the buyer. But you also have the loan escrow, where the buyer gives a deed of trust to the lender in exchange for the loan. So in a typical transaction, you've got actually 2 escrows. So each to pay their own means that the buyer and seller will split the cost of the sale escrow, but the buyer is paying for the cost of that loan escrow. If you refinance your house, does it go through an escrow? Of course it does, right? So again, you've got the loan escrow, you got the sale escrow. each to pay their own. That's when I guess there was quite a conversation at the Standard Forms Committee meeting regarding this, and this is how they came up with it. Okay, again, I am not in leadership. I just report out what I'm seeing. Okay, owner's title insurance, again, typically paid by the seller for the buyer. Buyer's lender's title insurance. You notice there's no checkbox there. It's just the buyer, because that's a loan fee. That's the cost of the loan. The lender requires the buyer as the borrower to pay for their lender's lender policy, their ALTA. Right? County transfer taxes, city transfer taxes. You may or may not be in a city that does a transfer tax, but of course we all have the county transfer tax. Typically seller pays for that. That's that $1.10 per thousand, right? HOA fee for preparing disclosures. Sellers required to give those disclosures under the civil code. So there's no box there. HOA certification fee. Again, some lenders will require the HOA to verify how many units are owner occupied or rented out. That's really a loan cost, so it's just for the buyer there. HOA transfer fees, again, negotiable there. Typically, we ask seller to pay for those. Private transfer fees, that may be a development burden that was put on the developer because of an environmental challenge against the project years ago. Again, typically we ask the seller to pay for those. And then Q16 and 17, either other fees or costs. And then Q18, if you want to have the seller pay for a home warranty plan, you can require it here. If the buyer doesn't want to ask the seller to pay for a home warranty plan, they can just check the box, buyer is waiving the home warranty plan. Buyer can always come back and pay for the home warranty plan if they want to, but I don't recommend checking the buyer box there, because now the lender may require the buyer to pay for a home warranty plan as a loan condition. They're over in the other terms. Q7, we identify the name of the escrow company. Q8, if we're going to have a different company do title other than the same company as the escrow, we can put that there. I know sometimes we have different companies do escrow and titles. All right. And then at the bottom there, Q18, we can put a cap on the cost of a home warranty plan and who the home warranty plan is going to be issued by. Right? Okay, so we got something up in the chat. So let me see what's there. Probably. Okay, well, okay. I guess I'm okay. Let us move on. Almost out of paragraph 3. Or other terms, right? Invariably, I get a question. So I'm like, well, what would you put in other terms? Well, something else that I haven't covered. Like what? Oh, gosh, I can't think of anything. C.A.R. has done a really good job, I think, of constructing paragraph 3 to give you every possible alternative. And they've given you lots of extra space again to put other stuff. Of course, if you need extra room here, I think you just keep putting your characters, and then that TOP form will automatically populate into this agreement. And now we go over to page 4. Just before we take our break, I want to talk about paragraph 4, if I could. It goes pretty quickly. And although these aren't really negotiable items, they are elective items. So I thought I'd get them out of the way. Paragraph 4A is our addenda. C.A.R. is doing away with the probate purchase agreement and the manufactured home or mobile home purchase agreement. Instead, you will just add one of these 2 addendums to this contract. So this contract will then adapt to a probate transaction or a manufactured home or mobile home transaction. Okay. I mean, the 2 contracts were virtually the same. They just need a little extra language for the rules under probate and mobile homes. Now, I mentioned earlier, tenant occupied property addendum. If you've got a situation where the tenant is in the property, we need to address that. You address that by attaching the TOPA. And then in that TOPA, if the buyer wants the tenant out 5 days prior to close, then the buyer needs to check that box in paragraph 1 of the TOPA. Like I said before, you don't have access to the TOPA yet, but if you want a copy, just email me. Happy to send you a copy of my of the TOPA. My email address is in the top of the chat. I will put my email address again when we take the break. Welcome to email me, but I'm not going to respond to emails until after this class, okay? Because Laura is cracking the whip. She only wants me to take a break for 10 minutes and then back with my shoulder to the grindstone, okay? She's a taskmaster. Now, we've got a couple of other forms here that these are new stuff, the TIC PA and the co-op PA. Let me address that tenants in common or tenancy in common purchase agreement, okay? So up in the Bay Area, maybe on the west side of Los Angeles, okay? Property is so expensive. What buyers have been doing is buying duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes together, okay? They've been buying these little multifamily unit properties together as tenancy in common. So they buy this property as a tenancy in common. They have a side agreement, and each one of those buyers gets to live in one of those units. Okay. It's not a subdivision, but DRE thinks it's kind of like a subdivision, but it's still one deed. So there's all kind of little rules we have to follow under the Subdivided Lands Act, and that's going to be addressed in this TIC form, okay? Fortunately, we don't have it out here in the Eastern San Gabriel Valley and Inland Empire, okay? But that's what that form is for. This stock cooperative purchase agreement, this is where a corporation or possibly a LLC buys the property, and the owners of that LLC or stock or corporation get to live in one of the units, kind of like we see back on the East Coast in New England or in New York, right? Well, again, not a subdivision, but from DRE's perspective, it is the subdivision of ownership of property. Even though there's just one deed, issues are addressed there to meet DRE approval. So what C.A.R. has done is they've met with the Department of Real Estate to satisfy the Department of Real Estate disclosure and obligations, right? B, other addenda. If you want to add any of these forms, hopefully we don't see that SSA or short sale addendum anytime soon. But if you've got want to add the addendum form, okay, the ADM, backup offer addendum, septic well monument addendum, buyer or seller intent to exchange, court confirmation addendum, that would be for conservatorships, guardianships, things of that nature. All right. And then C, buyer and seller advisories. One of the ones I want to draw your attention to is that second one under C on the left-hand side. Oh, sorry, third one under C on the left-hand side, excuse me, wildfire disaster advisory, the WDFA. I'm going to talk about this form again when we get into the home hardening disclosure, okay? If your property is not required to have that home hardening defensible space disclosure, okay? But the property is still in an area where there's a lot of vacant land or you're worried about, fire. I think that WDFA, that wildfire disaster advisory, is a good form to use instead of that home hardening form. If the law requires you to use that home hardening form, then you have to use it. But if the law does not require the home hardening form, but you're worried about wildfires just because of what's around the property, I think the way to go is that wildfire disaster advisory. It's an easier form to get through. So we're going to talk about that home hardening form a little bit later. When I talk about that, I'm going to draw your attention back to 4C, third document or third form down, wildfire disaster advisory. All right. Another form I just want to draw your attention to, you've got the pre-check forms that are going to come out, the BIA, the WFA, wire fraud, fair housing discrimination, California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, that thing. But that statewide buyer seller advisory, not pre-checked. I know in earlier versions of the contract, it was pre-checked. Take another look at that SBSA. It was updated about a year ago or so. They did a really nice job in the updating. On the second page is this really cool table of contents where you have a topical section at the top, and then at the bottom you have the alphabetical section. You got all kinds of good explanations, including explanation on what liquidated damages are, what mediation is, what arbitration is. So you don't have to explain those paragraphs to your buyer or even your seller. You can just give them a copy of the SBSA and say, look, C.A.R's already explained it to you, so I don't have to engage in the unlicensed practice of law and try to explain it and take the risk of getting it wrong. All right. Okay, so we've got some stuff in the chat. Let me do that, then we can take our break. Let's see, disregard question about probate. Okay, I can do that. Investors can hold title as ticks. Yes. As agents, should we verify how our sellers or clients hold title? No. Before I would go out on a listing appointment, Penny, I would always pull up the tax rolls. You can do that through Realist, through C.A.R. MLS, just to see the name on the tax rolls to make sure that's who I'm talking to in terms of the seller. Sometimes, true story, I actually knew an agent that wrote an offer on a property, got a counter offer back, didn't recognize the name on the counter offer because it didn't match the tax rolls. It was the seller, or it was the property owner's tenant. The tenant thought they could list the property and sell it without the landlord finding out about it. Now, we laugh about that, but again, you need to kind of verify that that person who's living in the property really is the seller. But how they hold title, don't worry about that. You're not expected to understand title, okay? The title companies will give a nice little disclosure of the different ways of holding title that you can share with the buyer. Now, the title companies are advising on title, not you. Yeah, don't get into the intricacies of holding title. Serious legal ramifications there, as well as tax ramifications as well. So as a buyer's agent writing up the RPA, do we need to check how the seller holds title? No, only to the extent that it doesn't hurt just to verify who's on the tax rolls, and when you get a counter offer, it's a similar name, right? But if the name is completely different, you might want to call up that listing agent and say, hey, did you know the name on the title is Martinez, but the counter offer is coming from somebody named Jones? Are these the same people? You know, you don't want embarrassment in escrow, right? The tax roll does not show how they hold title, it just has their name. It has their name, but it could also say the LLC, it could also say the corporation. So let's compromise here. It will show who a purported owner is likely to be, okay? It's just kind of a guide, okay? It doesn't hurt to look. Let's see, the question, when we write the RPA, how would we know when to use the checkbox with the 4A, the tick? If you've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buyers buying a multi-unit property and they are intending to own it together as tenants in common, then the tick would kick in, okay? But they are telling you this. You're not advising them this. They're telling you this. That's when the TIC. I doubt you're ever going to use the TIC. This is really for West Los Angeles, okay? Santa Monica, maybe Venice, Huntington Beach, or around the Bay Area, San Francisco, okay? Where properties are so outrageously expensive. Do I see this in Walnut? No, I don't. Fortunately not, because this is going to be a headache, okay? Now we're going to be getting into subdivision law. And the Subdivision Lands Act is a monster. That's that preliminary public report, that final public report, that's that stuff. Hopefully we don't have to deal with that, all right? Laura, I think I'm done with the chat and I'm done with paragraph 4. And by my watch, it is 11:30. So this is a good time for a 10-minute break. So we're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. And I'm actually going to go and set my clock or my timer for 10 minutes. And I've started it now. So if you need to get a cup of coffee, tea, use the restroom, now's the time to do it. We will regroup here. I'm going to try to get back around 8 minutes and just go through the chat and see if there's any leftover questions. Before I do that, I'm going to go into the chat and put in my email so you can email me. This webinar is going to be posted on the Tri-Counties website within the next couple of days. All right. My earlier presentation, actually, this is my third one, I think. My earlier presentations are also recorded. So if you don't like this one, you might like the earlier one better. My first one wasn't as good. My second one was pretty good. I think this one's pretty good too. So I get better. I'm kind of like cheese and wine. I get better as I age, but those will be there too. We're now at 9 minutes. So let me put my email in. I'm going to go take a quick break and then I'll be back. Well, my break took me less than I thought, so we still have about 3.5 minutes. If anybody wants to shoot something into the chat, you're welcome to. I'll do my best to answer that, but we'll give you the full 10 minutes to get back into your seats. Okay, so we are now back. I got one thing in the chat. Let me see what that is. May I know if you're going to have the RPA class in the future? As I was late to the meeting this morning. Yes, we will. Off the top of my head, excuse me, I don't know if Laura and I have scheduled, excuse me, a date next month or not, but I'm sure we will. But this meeting or this, excuse me, I just started coughing almost. But this will be recorded so you can watch it again. But yes, we will have more classes depending on demand, I'm sure in January. Just need to coordinate with Laura. Having trouble through the entire video being booted out and go back in. Debbie, you're the only one that's reported that to the best of my knowledge, so it might be on your side. But I mentioned before, this is being recorded. It will be posted on the Tri-County's website. And Laura, if you want to add anything to that. I don't know, Laura, have we scheduled a class on this contract in January? You're muted.
Not yet, but I'm working on that in the month
Okay.
of December. So we'll get together on that.
Okay, so at the end, you can say nice things about me and then Laura will bring me back, right? Okay. So let's go ahead now and get into paragraph 5. additional terms. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be moving a little bit faster now because essentially we've talked about all this, right? I talked about all this in the first 90 minutes. And at this point, all I have to do is kind of fill in the gaps. So paragraph 5 deals with additional terms affecting the purchase price, the initial deposit, the increase of deposit, and then retention of the deposit. Remember, you cannot call something a non-refundable deposit in residential transactions in California. Matter of fact, California law says that all deposits are refundable. So to call something a non-refundable deposit would be the unlicensed practice of the wrong law, which you don't want to do. You can have a liquidated damages clause, which is what this contract allows you to do, but make sure that you refer to it as a liquidated damages. Do not refer to it as a non-refundable deposit because that can get you into trouble. That's explained there in 5A3. 5B talks about whether you're going to have an all cash offer or not. Again, if that box was checked. Now, as we go through this paragraph, you'll notice that this paragraph refers to other paragraphs in the contract. For example, under 5A1, you see a reference to 3D1 right underneath the word deposit. Okay. If you hover over that with your cursor in zip forms, then you're going to get a pop-up of 3D1. So you can kind of go back and see, oh, what was this regards to? If you click on it, it'll take you back to 3D1. And then in 3D1, if you go to that second column under 3A, you can come back here to 5A1, right? So you can toggle back and forth between the paragraphs, or so I am told. Again, as soon as this contract comes out, we don't know when this month it's going to come out, but it will come out sometime. We're all going to jump on and play with it, okay? But C.A.R. has not told us when. I've heard December 6th. I've heard December 14th. I've heard December 27th. I've heard December 15th. It's going to come out when C.A.R. can bring it out. And I'm not sure they're going to give any advance notice. It's just going to be there and we're going to be off into the new contract. The old contract will go away. Please do not try to save the old contract or do anything with the old contract. You need to move forward into the new contract because the addendas are all going to change as well, right? All right. Sorry about that. First loan, okay. Again, we talked about the first loan, additional financing amount, buyer's loan status. This is kind of neat. 5C3, buyer's loan status. This contract allows the seller's agent to contact the buyer's lender to find out what's going on with the buyer's loan. Now, they don't get to look at the credit score. They don't get to look at their loan ratios. They don't learn like that juicy stuff, but just to get a status report, how the loan is doing, this contract allows the seller's agent to do that, okay? Because I know we sometimes have problems. The seller's agent, the seller's wondering on what's going on with the buyer and their loan. Well, now the seller's agent has authorization to contact the buyer's lender directly to find out what's going on, all right? And then as I mentioned before, under C4, special terms and conditions for FHA and VA, all right? D explains the balance of the purchase price. E, limits of credits to buyer. Sometimes sellers may provide an excessive credit to buyer that exceeds the cost of whatever that item is. So let's say the seller agrees to pay buyer's closing costs of $6,000. The buyer's closing costs are only $5,500. So buyer's getting an extra $500. It's not going to the lender. The buyer basically gets to pocket that, right? Well, here's the problem. We all know that the sweet spot for a loan is 20% down. That's what lenders love. Can buyers buy properties with less than 20% down? Of course they can. But that's going to trigger insurance or a guarantee, right? Well, if you've got a buyer that's coming in at 20%, but the seller's providing an excessive credit, let's say $500 more than what the actual costs are. Buyer's actually pocketing that money, which means they're not really coming in with 20% down. They're coming in with 19.925% down or something like that, right? That's going to trigger a problem with the lender because that loan requires the buyer to come in with the 20% down of the buyer's money. So what this paragraph says is that situation occurs, then that excessive credit will give it back to the seller and there will be no reduction or change in the purchase price, okay? So it's really a lender thing, just advising the parties that this is a lender thing. Take it up with your lender if you have an issue with it, all right? Moving on, if I can, and I do see a couple in the chat. Let me go into the chat and take care of these two real quick. Okay. Okay, just Laura and one of you chatting back and forth. Okay, 6, additional financing terms. Again, verification of down payment and closing costs. We talked about that. And verification of loan applications. Talked about that earlier in paragraph 3. Again, notice how they reference the different paragraphs that you can hover over and go back and forth. All right. Now we go into page 5. So we're picking up some speed. C, buyer stated financing. Remember earlier I said the default language for this contract is a conventional loan. Okay. If you have an FHA or VA or some other animal that's not a conventional loan, you need to let the seller know that. Okay. So seller is relying on the buyer's representation of the type of financing. Misrepresenting that could be viewed as a intentional misrepresentation or even fraud. So again, be very clear in your offer what type of loan you're providing or your buyer is going to be getting. Again, I don't think it's a big issue if you go from a fixed to an adjustable, right? But if you're going from a conventional to a government, that's a big thing. Right? Paragraph 7, closing and occupancy. Okay, so again, we talked about this. The seller is transferring the property in its present or as is condition. Seller's not obligated to make any repairs unless agreed to do so in writing. And you would want to put that in other terms or use a request for repairs. All right. C refers the issue of seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. And again, earlier we talked about the use of the SIP or seller in possession form or the RLAS, residential lease after sale. Again, depending on if the seller occupancy after close is 29 days or less or 39 days or 30 days or longer. Okay. D mentions at close of escrow, seller assigns to buyer all assignable warranty rights. And seller under E is going to provide to buyer all means to enter the property, like keys, passwords, codes, keys to open locks, mailboxes, security systems, things of that nature. We're going to get into a little bit more detail on this when we get into paragraph 9, because smart homes need to be connected to the cloud. Access to the cloud is also going to be transferred over to the buyer. Right? Paragraph 8. Now, this is one of the things I like about the new contract. So we remember we were in paragraph 3L. We had the loan contingency, the appraisal contingency, the investigation, the review of seller documents, the title, and they were all in a specific order. Okay? Notice here in paragraph 8, A, B, C, D, E, they're in the same order. See, one of the things that I had an issue of earlier versions of the purchase agreement is C.A.R. would keep amending it, but they would kind of like shoehorn things in, and they were never in quite a good order. One of the things they did with this contract, they reorganized the whole thing, and they've kept it in a consistent order. So the items listed in 3L in the order of loan, appraisal, investigation, review of seller documents, title, that order is in the same order here in paragraph 8. So even though this is a brand new form for you guys, it's going to take a little bit getting used to. Once you master paragraph 3, which I don't think should take too long, then it's going to be real easy to jump into the other areas of the contract, because remember, everything in paragraph 3 is reference to a later contract or later paragraph later in the contract. And later in the contract, like paragraph 8, if we look at that first line under 8A1, it references back to 3L1. And to make it easier when you're in zip forms, if you hover over that 3L1, it's actually a little icon. It'll give you a pop-up of 3L1. If you click on it, it'll take you back to 3L1. So I think in the mechanics of using this form, it's going to be a lot easier for you. Okay, it's going to take a while to get used to it. I grant that. It took me a while to get used to it. But now that I'm used to it, it's getting pretty comfortable. Okay, so we've got something in the chat. Let me get through paragraph 8, and then I'm going to go into the chat. So F is the condominium plan unit development disclosures. G is the review of those leased lien items, those hero PACE loan stuff, right? And then H is removal or waiver of contingency with offer. Probably going to talk about this a little bit later. You can remove contingencies listed in this contract with that contingency removal form. Of course, with appraisal and loan, you can remove it with the offer. But you cannot remove the buyer's right to cancel upon receipt of a mandated disclosure. So even if the buyer writes a non-contingent offer, when they receive that transfer disclosure statement, the TDS, they will now have 3 days from personal receipt, 5 days from mail or electronic mail receipt to cancel. And you cannot waive that. So NHD, lead-based paint, TDS, any of the home hardening, any of those mandated disclosures, all right, they survive a non-contingent offer. Now, before all of you start getting excited and saying, oh, great, I can write non-contingent offers and my buyer can still cancel when he gets the TDS. What if you have a seller that's exempt from TDS? Oh, nuts. What happened? Okay, so be very careful. You do not know whether that seller is or is not exempt from a mandated disclosure. So be very careful about releasing contingencies, because releasing contingencies could put the buyer in the obligation to purchase the property, even though they find something wrong with the property. All right. All right. So I think we've covered paragraph 8. We have. Before we go into paragraph 9, let me look in the chat. Oh, just a thank you. We like thank yous. Okay, so remember I said when we were talking about paragraph 9 back in paragraph 3P, 1 was items included, P2 was items to be excluded. Well, here we go into detail about items that are already going to be excluded or excluded. Okay. Now, under 9A, note the buyer and seller, it says specifically that things mentioned as being included or excluded in the MLS are not a part of this contract unless they're specified back in 3P1 or 3P2. However, you put in the MLS that washer and dryer included, but then you fail to mention it in this contract or in a counter order to this contract. And that seller takes that washer and dryer with them. And that seller now, that buyer now sues you, both of you, the listing agent and the selling agent, the buyer's agent and the seller's agent. Okay. The small claims court judge is going to probably rule in favor of the buyer, because they're going to say that that MLS statement that washer and dryer included was a representation. It was not fulfilled, so it's a misrepresentation, and the agent should have caught that. So again, be very careful. If something is listed as included or excluded in the MLS, the agent writing the offer needs to reiterate that And if they don't, the agent representing the seller needs to clarify it in a counteroffer. Okay, you don't want to have a mistake on that. So 9B, all items included in the property. So this is an expansion of what we've seen under the old agreement. And I call your attention to subparagraph 3, security systems. 4, home automation, smart home features. 5, non-dedicated devices, all kinds of stuff. See, what's a smart home without the owner being able to access to the cloud to make the lights turn on and the doors unlock from their cell phone? It's a dumb home, right? But what you sold was a smart home. So the phone belongs to the seller. The Alexa device belongs to the seller because it's not dedicated to the house. But the code, the ability to link up, that has to be transferred to the buyer as well. So the seller needs to let the buyer know what the codes or whatever it is, so the buyer can hook up into the cloud to operate all the devices, okay? And that includes smart light bulbs, okay? So light bulbs are included in the transfer now. They are considered to be real property, regardless of what the Maria test is, particularly if it's a smart light bulb. You know, that's a light bulb where you can clap your hands and turn the light on, or you can tell Alexis to turn the light on or anything. That's all included now, okay, because it's integrated into the property. And then under C, we have a little change from the old agreement. Under C, okay, not only does the TV monitor go with the seller, but the bracket goes with the seller as well, okay? So if you want to include the bracket, you got to make a note of that back in 3P1, okay? So there's been a change in the current or old, soon to be old purchase agreement. The bracket was included. Under the new agreement, the bracket is not included with the house. Seller still has to patch the holes, but doesn't have to repaint. All right. Okay, so no chat, so we can move on. Page 7. I told you we move fast. Page 7, paragraph 10, allocation of costs. Okay, so now we've already decided or negotiated who's going to pay. Okay, but what does all that mean? Well, that's explained here. Okay, specifically, when we talk about things like government required and corrective remedial actions, further explains any under B2 point of sale requirements. Statewide, we don't have any, but local jurisdictions might. So that's something you need to be aware of. If you're not sure if the city you're in does require a point of sale inspection or retrofit, Laura can give you the name of your GAD, Government Affairs Director, and your GAD person there at the association can let you in on what cities require what, okay? C explains what a home warranty is. Now, I get you guys know what a home warranty is, right? It's an insurance policy for major appliances like air conditioning, heating, range, oven, heaters, things like that, right? But buyers and sellers may not know what that is. So again, the contract needs to explain that. That is one of the challenges with this new agreement. We are all so comfortable with these terms, we can pretty much get by with just paragraph 3. We know what it means. Buyers and sellers don't. So that's why paragraph 3 is explained in greater detail. What makes it nice for you is all your negotiated items are right there in the first 3 pages, with the exception of liquidated damages in arbitration. All right. So moving on, paragraph 11 are statutory disclosures. Okay. So again, A talks about TDS, NHD, and other statutory disclosures. Remember, if your seller has to do a TDS, this contract requires that they also complete an SPQ, seller property questionnaire. So with the transfer disclosure statement, you've got to do a seller property questionnaire. If your seller is exempt from a TDS, that would be a lender selling a property who they took back through foreclosure. We call that an REO for you new agents, right? That would be a probate. That would be a testamentary trust, and the person died and their children who are successor trustees are selling the property. That would be anywhere that requires court action, conservatorship, guardianships, bankruptcies, forced sales, okay? Those are exempt from TDS. So they don't have to do an SPQ, seller property questionnaire, but they have to do an ESD, exempt seller disclosure. Now, one of the challenges is those sellers may not want to do an ESD, even though the contract says so. So you need to have a conversation as the listing agent with your seller. Will they do an ESD if they won't do, if the law does not require them to do a TDS? Because this contract requires them to do an ESD if they are statutory exempt from a TDS. And if they say, no, we don't want to do an ESD. Well, when an offer comes in, you're going to have to make sure you counter the ESD out, or you can put in confidential remarks in the MLS, seller will not complete an ESD. Please take that out of your offer. Of course, that buyer's agent probably won't understand what you're saying in the MLS unless they've been to one of my classes. So I'm not sure how good that's going to be. All right. Another thing that sometimes comes up, your investor sellers. Okay. Your investor sellers don't like to do TDSs. I know that. They think they're exempt, but they're not. Person who buys a property, never goes in it, rents it out, now sells it. Do they, under the law, have to do a TDS? Yes, they do. Okay, they're not exempt. Do they have to do an SPQ? Under the contract, they do. Can they counter it out? Yes, they could. Okay, so again, have that conversation with your seller. So your seller by contract is agreeing to do either the SPQ or the ESD, depending on if they have to do a TDS. If they don't want to do an SPQ or an ESD, can they counter it out? Yes, they can. But, and let me make this really clear, if you have a seller who's lived in the property, particularly for a long period of time, I strongly encourage those sellers to complete an SPQ, because there's all kinds of good information that's valuable to buyers contained in that SPQ. And unfortunately, the TDS does not ask enough questions to the seller about the condition of the property, and the SPQ does. So I strongly recommend the SPQ for sellers who are living in the property. The seller's never lived in the property. That SPQ is not going to contain a lot of information, because a lot of the boxes are just going to be no, because the seller, having never lived in the property, doesn't know a whole lot about the property, right? Paragraph B, lead-based paint disclosures. Again, if the property was built prior to 1978, federal law requires that lead-based paint be given. They changed the name. It's now the LPD. It used to be the FLD, I think. But FLD looked like flood, right? So they changed it to LPD because people were thinking it was a flood disclosure. No, it's the LPD. Every now and then I get a question, well, what if my seller painted their house or built the house in 79 and they used old paint? Do I have to give lead-based paint? No, no. The law says if the property was built before 78, then you give the lead-based paint disclosure. Okay. Remember, in California, lead was basically removed out of all paints in the late 60s because of environmental laws here in California. But under federal law, lead was removed from paint in 1978. So it's a federal law. Again, don't need to make a federal case out of it, but it is a federal case, right? All right. So moving on into page 8. Okay, home fire hardening and defensible space. So we have this FHDS form. It's kind of like son of TDS, okay? When do you have to give the FHDS form, okay? The FHDS form deals with home hardening. In other words, protecting homes from fire, embers basically coming in from an approaching wildfire, or defensible space, keeping brush cleared away from the house so that firefighters can fight the fire when it comes in. Okay. We have 3 things that have to occur in order to trigger this form. Number 1, the seller has to give a TDS. So the seller must give a TDS. That's requirement 1. Second, the NHD report for this property shows that the property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. And 3, the home was built before 2010. So if all 3 of those exist, seller has to give a TDS, NHD shows it in the fire zone, home was built prior to 2010, then you have to give the FHDS from home fire hardening and defensible space. And it's a challenging form because the form talks about local governmental inspections and approvals. And many of our local governments don't do those yet because they haven't gotten caught up with it. So you're sitting here, I don't know what to do. Okay. Which is why I said earlier, if you don't have those 3 things, you have 1 of them or 2 of them, but not all 3. You don't have to give the FHDS, but you know that, it could be a fire danger. Go back to that wildfire disclosure advisory form that I mentioned earlier in paragraph 4. Okay. I think you'll find that an easier form to use. Now, if your broker wants you to do the FHDS, so that's what you have to do. Okay. But for you brokers and managers out there, hopefully you understand where I'm coming from. When you look at that FHDS, it can be a little bit of a bear. If it's not required, I would go back to that wildfire disclosure advisory. Okay, I think that will get you to where you want to be with a lot less headache. Okay, so E, waiver prohibited. Remember I talked earlier, you cannot waive a TDS, an NHD, an FHDS, a lead-based paint. Buyer can't waive those. Even if you put in the contract as the buyers buy the property, waives all statutory disclosures. No, they can still cancel because you cannot waive a statutory right. Okay, so just FYI on that. But don't go writing non-contingent offers thinking, well, my buyer can still cancel because when he gets the TDS, he'll just cancel if he doesn't like the property. Well, what if the seller doesn't have to give a TDS, right? What if the seller doesn't have to give lead-based paint? What if the seller doesn't have to give an NHD? There are exceptions there. So again, be very careful with your non-contingent offers, right? Again, return of signed copies, 5 days. We talked about that. And termination rights, okay? We'll talk about that more when we get into paragraph 14. Again, when you receive a statutory disclosure, the buyer receives a statutory disclosure. If it's personally delivered, you've got 3 days to rescind. If it's sent to you by mail, which includes email, got 5 days to rescind. Do you have to give a reason? No. The legislature actually wanted that TDS to be given to buyers before they wrote the offer. So if you give a TDS after you're in escrow, as far as the legislature is concerned, you're late. And the legislature decided we're going to let the buyer cancel for no reason whatsoever. They don't even have to give a reason. It's just that they've got 3 days from personal delivery of that TDS. They can cancel. Okay. Paragraph H, withholding taxes, known as FERPTA. So what this contract now does is it clears it up a little bit more and says that the buyer will withhold 15% under FERPTA for federal tax and 3 1/3% for state income tax on the sale of property. Unless the seller provides the buyer with that AS form, which you all know is the FERPTA form, okay, Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Act, in which the seller declares that they are not a foreign national, and they give their tax ID number, which is typically your social security number, to the buyer. Of course, sellers don't really want to give their social security number to the buyer because of the chance of identity theft. So if escrow agrees, typically your escrow companies, title companies, banks, if they're doing escrows, will agree to be a qualified substitute. Okay. And now the seller makes their AS form or FERPTA disclosure to the escrow. Escrow notifies the buyer and seller that they are acting as a qualified substitute, and the buyer does not have to worry about withholding. Okay, so the buyer is now relieved of any obligation. Paragraph I, statutory requirement to disclose the Megan's Law website. Do not go on there with your buyer because your buyer's going to have a lot of questions. It's amazing how many convicted sexual predators there are out there. Refer them and their questions to your local police department. If you're in the county or unincorporated area or a contract city, local sheriff's department. Similar disclosure given for gas and hazardous liquid transmission pipelines. Okay? Something's in the chat. Let me see. If the property is under probate sale and one of the successor is living in the property for more than 10 years, does the seller need to fill out the TDS and SPQ? My thing is yes, because if the seller has been occupying the property for 10 years, it's really not, as I would interpret the legislature felt a probate was. So my recommendation to the seller is yes, do a TDS and do a lead-based, or excuse me, do a TDS and do an SPQ, okay? Because they've actually taken up occupancy. That's a long time. Okay, Gail agrees with me. I love it when my attendees agree with me. I just feel so much better that way. Okay, so let us move on. Hey, so we're now in page 9, paragraph 12. And again, this discloses to buyer that they also have an obligation to investigate the property. It also poses some limitations on their inspections. Their inspections are not supposed to be intrusive. In other words, they can't damage the property. And you'll notice under 12B1C, specifically dealing for termite inspections, if we want to call it that, there's limitations of what that termite inspector is allowed to do. Now, our termite inspectors know this. The most common thing, you don't want to test the shower pan for leaks in a multifamily dwelling, because the only way you know if it leaks is if water gets out of the shower after you've plugged the drain. Well, if the water gets out of the shower after you've plugged the drain, then it's going to be seeping into the unit below you, right? So again, so there are some limitations there for both the general home inspection, physical inspection, stuff like that. So they cannot make an intrusive inspection or damage the property. And then I draw your attention down to 12E at the bottom, that the buyer does indemnify the seller for any damage, either caused by the buyer or one of the buyer's agents, which would include the inspectors, for damaging the property. Okay. Title investing. Again, we've talked about this earlier. We do not advise buyers how to take title, how to hold title. Okay. We can give them that little form from the title company, shows the tenancy in common, joint tenancy, community property right of survivorship, etc. Okay, we can give that to them, but we don't even tell them how we hold title, because that could be a recommendation. Okay, and we don't want to go there. Also, this paragraph goes into the CLTA, the ALTA, the ALTA-R. Depending on where you are, title companies will be issuing different policies. Basically, the best policy for the buyer is going to be given to the buyer if it is available. So it does not rise to the same level as the full lender's policy, but if the local area does have an enhanced buyer's policy, the enhanced buyer's policy will be given. Okay, your local title company can tell you what policies they are issuing in that area. Also, if you are in a geographic targeting order area, this is an area where money laundering is occurring. Southern California is a prime area. I think Los Angeles County. Don't know about San Bernardino and Riverside counties, but if you are in one of these targeting order areas issued by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, then the buyer will comply with those regulations. Okay, your title company, your escrow companies can let you know if you're in one of those targeting order areas, right? Paragraph 14. Paragraph 14 is still paragraph 14. It was paragraph 14 in the previous and the previous contract. So C.A.R. has decided, we're just going to do time periods, removal of contingencies, cancellation rights, all in the same paragraph. So we've already learned, or we've already gone over, the seller has 7 days to provide all disclosures to the buyer. The buyer's going to have 17 days, again, from the date of acceptance, to review all those disclosures. If there's a late disclosure, again, the buyer has a contingency period, 17 days from the date of acceptance, or 5 days from the date of delivery, whichever occurs last. So hopefully I've gone over that enough. I don't have to beat a dead horse anymore. If a party has not provided or not done what they're supposed to, then the other party can give a 2-day notice to perform. Okay, so if the seller doesn't give the TDS to the buyer can give a notice to perform to the seller. If the buyer doesn't release their contingencies, the seller can give the buyer a notice to perform. It is a 2-day notice, right? And it can be given 2 days early. In earlier contracts, you could do the 2 days, or you could add something. I think what C.A.R. just said, look, because we can give the notice early, there's no reason to change. We need to give the party their full time period in which to perform. You can change those time periods in which to perform, but the actual notice to do something, it's going to be a 2-day notice, and you can give it 2 days before the deadline. So to seller on the 7-day notice, 7 days to deliver documents to the buyer, you could get delivered as early as the 5th day. For the buyer, delivery of notice to release appraisal, loan, contingencies, inspection contingencies, it's a 17-day period. You can give it as early as the 15th day. Okay, so again, that's how that works. There's another clause in here that gets a little bit of confusion, and just want to reiterate it. It's actually in page 11. It's G, demand to close escrow. There's always been a little confusion of how this demand to close escrow works. So let me see if I can explain it. It's a little complicated. Okay, so we have the contingency period. We have the period for the buyer, for the seller to deliver documents to the buyer. Okay, so that's all going to be resolved hopefully by the 17th day, right? If the buyer doesn't release his contingencies, they continue to run. Remember, the buyer's contingencies have to be released in writing, signed by the buyer, all right? So we work that all out. Buyer releases their contingencies. All is good. All disclosures have been given to the buyer. We're good. We're going to close now, all right? We come up to close of escrow, and something's wrong. Okay? Buyer's loan hasn't funded. Buyer hasn't brought in their closing costs or the balance of their down payment or whatever needs to be done. We're at the end, and buyer's not performing. What do we do? Well, seller says, well, the heck with this. Let's cancel. Not so fast. You see, before the seller can cancel, they need to give the buyer a 3-day demand to close escrow notice. The thinking is we need to give the buyer 3 more days to get their act together. All right. That's at the end of the transaction, or when the transaction is supposed to end. You don't have to worry about this demand to close escrow or those 3-day notice back on the release of contingencies. No, seller gives a notice to perform to the buyer. on or after the 15th day. After those 2 days, buyer doesn't release contingencies, seller can cancel. They don't have to cancel, but they can't cancel unless they first give that 2-day notice to release contingencies. Okay, that's over there. We're talking about here in paragraph 14G is when we're at close of escrow, contingencies have been released, seller wants to cancel because buyer's loan hasn't funded or whatever, or buyer wants more time, and seller says, no more time. Before the seller can cancel, they have to give this demand to close escrow, and it's a 3-day, basically a 3-day notice. Okay, let's go back into the chat, see what's going on there. Yeah, okay. We like that. Okay, so paragraph 15, repairs. So any repairs done by the seller, okay, will be done properly. Paid receipts will be given to the buyer. So the buyer knows that the contractor was paid. So the buyer doesn't have to worry about the contractor coming after the buyer or maybe filing a mechanics lien on the property after the buyer has closed escrow. Paragraph 16 is our final verification of condition or final walkthrough. Again, 5 days prior to close of escrow, as we talked about earlier in paragraph 3. Oops. Paragraph 17, proration. So this is allocation of costs, income based on ownership. So property taxes, insurance, rents, interests can all be prorated. Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm selling you a property, an apartment building, and we're going to close escrow on the 15th of the month. Is it safe to say I've collected all the rents? Yeah, probably have. Are you entitled to half of those rents because you're going to own the property for the second half of the month? Yes, you are. So what escrow is going to do is they're going to reduce the price you're paying me by a half a month's rent because I've already collected the entire month's rent. That's a proration. So again, property taxes, interest, insurance, because insurance can be taken over by the buyer from the seller. These are expenses or incomes, like in the case of rent, they can be prorated. Paragraph 18 states that a separate agreement is going to allocate a commission, compensation between the agents, okay? Normally it's a listing agreement between the seller and the seller's agent, which is now going to be shared in some fashion through the MLS, which is also a contractual agreement. I know you think of the MLS as a marketing tool, but it's actually a contractual agreement between you and all the other members of C.A.R. MLS, okay? Sharing the commission with the buyer, okay? Do not, under any circumstance, put your commission in this agreement, okay? First of all, you're not a party to this agreement, okay? Secondly, in residential transactions, 1 to 4 units, the statute of fraud says you must have a disclosure either in red print or 10-point bold type that commissions are negotiable and not set by law. You see that in the listing agreement. You see that in the buyer representation agreement. Okay, it's not in this agreement. So putting your commission in this agreement or changing your commission in this agreement violates the statute of frauds. And it looks like you're engaged in the unlicensed practice of, again, the wrong law. You don't want to do that, okay? So if you're writing an offer on a for sale by owner, you need to get that for sale by owner to sign an SP form, okay, single party compensation agreement, prior to your buyer looking at that property, so you know your commission is protected. Once the seller signs the SP form, then show the buyer the property, write the offer, present the offer, get it accepted. The seller now will owe you a commission if it closes, but you have not created agency with that seller, okay? That's the way you want to do it. If you want to change your commission between 2 agents, you don't like what's being offered in the MLS, use the CBC form, Cooperating Broker Compensation Form. That's the form we use to change what is offered or create an agreement for sharing of commissions. Let's say if the property's not in the MLS, right? Okay, CBC for altering or establishing commissions between agents. SP, the form to create a obligation to pay a commission by a seller, all right, that you don't have a listing for, right? Hopefully I've covered that well. Paragraph 19 refers to escrow. Which paragraphs in this contract does escrow need to be concerned with? All right, looks like we got something in the chat. If there's a problem noted on the final walkthrough, what can the buyer do? Contact escrow, say closing needs to be delayed. Okay, that's my first, since I don't know what the problem is. Kind of depends on what the problem is. If it's a minor problem, perhaps the parties can create an agreement right there on how to resolve it. Normally it's resolved with money. Any money passing through the parties, always good idea to have it go through escrow, okay? Because there's always the chance of monies going from the seller to the buyer that might violate the lender's procedures, and that could be viewed as loan fraud, okay? Question from Nicholas. I am out of the country and my Wi-Fi is choppy. Is this being recorded? Yes, it is. I know Mr. S is a great instructor. Thank you. I would rather an opportunity to watch the training. Yes, it is recorded. It will be on the Tri-County's website. Give Laura a day or two to get it up there, okay? But I'm sure she'll have it up by the weekend. So instead of watching college playoffs or championships, you can watch me again. Oh, wouldn't that be nasty? Okay, let's move on. Page 12. Okay. Again, more instructions, escrow, what she or he will do. Although I've only met 1 or 2 male escrow officers. They're always women. I'm not sure why that is. Paragraph 20, remember selection of service providers. Escrow, title, NHD, all those people. That's a decision between the buyer and the seller. Please don't insist on someone because that could be viewed as a RESPA violation. Why would you insist on a particular escrow company? You may have some issues with escrow companies or title companies not providing good service. That you can make recommendations to your seller, but be very careful on insisting on somebody because we have seen kickbacks from third-party providers, service providers back to agents. Also states that we don't warrant or guarantee the service of the service providers. Okay, it's a decision between the buyer and the seller. All right. Paragraph 21 states that we will report this sale to the MLS. As a matter of fact, as a member of C.A.R. MLS, you are required to report your sales to the MLS. If you're representing the buyer, always go back into the MLS after escrow is closed. Make sure you're getting credit for representing the buyer. There are unfortunately some listing agents out there, some sellers agents, who will put themselves on both sides so they can quote unquote get credit for both sides. Should they ever leave their current broker and go to another broker, that other broker will look back in the MLS to see how many transactions they had to establish their commission split. You want to make sure you get credit for your sales. Simply call the listing agent up and say, hey, I was looking on the MLS on our sale. It looks like you put yourself down as representing the buyer. It was me. And they might go, oh, did I do that? Did I make a mistake? Oh, yes, you did. You know what you did. No, don't get upset. Just remind them to change it. If they don't change it, have your broker call their broker. If that doesn't work, report them to C.A.R. MLS. They're going to get their hand slapped real fast. Okay, that's a big C.A.R. MLS no-no. All right. If you litigate, okay, buyer and seller litigates, attorney fees will be awarded to the winning party, provided they try to mediate the case first. We'll talk about mediation in a little bit. Paragraph 3 is our paragraph on assignment. So just to revisit what I already said, okay, if the buyer wants to assign their rights, in other words, transfer their position to another buyer. Okay, they must make that request to the seller within 17 days of acceptance. If they're getting paid to assign it to another party, they have to disclose how much they're getting paid. Okay, if they wait until after the 17 days, seller doesn't have to approve it. If they do it within the 17 days, seller will not unreasonably deny their request. Please don't ask me to explain or define unreasonably. It's going to be a case-by-case basis, okay? However, if buyer is simply going to put title in the name of their trust or into an LLC and they're the sole owner of the LLC, that does not require seller approval, okay? Paragraph 24 is our commitment to fair housing.
How are you? I hope you had Thanksgiving. Just thought of you a couple of days ago.
Say, we're getting some feedback, Laura. Can you mute everybody? I'm sure everybody's real happy about their Thanksgiving holiday, but doesn't need to be shared with everyone. Okay. As I said before, paragraph 24 is our commitment to fair housing and our compliance with fair housing laws. And then paragraph 25 gets into our definitions. And this is where we're going to start talking about days, because that's the one that gets everybody in a quandary. But before we do that, let me go into the chat and see what's here. How do we control the fees charged to a buyer when the selling agent chooses the escrow company? Can we put a dollar amount? Well, okay, so for the seller to choose the escrow company, they're going to have to counter this offer. The offer is written by the buyer, and the buyer can specify the escrow company, right? Please don't put in seller's choice, okay? You're just asking for problems like this question popped up, okay? There's actually a title company down in San Diego, or there was, called Seller's Choice, right? And he didn't even know what that meant. He just thought it was a cute name. So do not use the word seller's choice. Specify the title company. Or call a listing agent before you write the offer and ask the listing agent, hey, do you have a particular title company or escrow company you really want to use? Okay. You're going to call them anyway because you want to know if the property is still available. You want to let them know you're writing an offer. Okay. You want to let them know if there's any other offers on the property, right? Okay. So when you're having that conversation, ask them about title, escrow, even NHD or home warranty, right? Okay. So you're writing the offer to the seller. You put in the title company, the escrow company, you get a counter offer back, and they want to change escrow companies or title companies. Simply call the escrow company, title company, and say, hey, we're in negotiations with the property, and the purchase price is going to be on or around $800,000, whatever it is. What are your fees? Is that for the buyer or buyer and seller? We're going to be each to pay their own, and they'll tell you. And then if you don't like it, then you counter it back. Okay. So again, but simple phone call to that escrow or title company, they'll tell you. It may even be on their website, depending on the company. Okay. After close of escrow, can the pictures be removed from the MLS? I don't believe so. I think they're all locked in. Okay. Contact C.A.R. MLS. You know, if you call C.A.R. MLS, you are going to find that they are so helpful. They really do want to help you. I know most of the time when agents hear from the C.A.R. MLS, it's because they have an infraction, they did something naughty, right? But if you call them, tell them what you want to do or why, they'll let you know. Okay. Matter of fact, I've got a great relationship with their general counsel, Ed Zorn. We share the same first name. So how would that transfer work? Example. Miriam, I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about. Either repost it with a little bit more detail in the chat or stay after. Be happy to talk with you then. Okay, Nancy, if the property mark sell as is, first of all, the contract says that the property is going to be sold as is, okay? I worry about people putting as is in the MLS or in your advertising or in a counter offer. Because if you say, hey, I'm selling this to you as is, if you buy a used car as is, what are you thinking? there's problems, right? Piece of crap. That's what you're thinking. If you ever go in front of a jury on a misrepresentation or a lack of disclosure issue, you've got in the MLS or you got an account or as is, that's not going to play well with the jury. Okay. So the offer is coming in as is. If the buyer wants repairs to the property, they have to specify it in the offer. Okay. When you go into escrow, if the buyer discovers defects in the property, they have to give a request for repairs. And then you can decline to do the request for repairs. Okay. If you want to put in confidential remarks, seller is not interested in making any repairs to the property. You're probably okay with that language, but I don't like the words as is. Okay. Okay, I think I've got the chats done there. Let us now move on. Okay. So now we get into days, and that is going to be 25I, okay? Counting days. So this is put in painful detail. And in talking to C.A.R.'s legal counsel, they said, it's so clear. Yeah, if you're a corporate lawyer, it's clear, but the rest of the world, it's not that clear. Let me talk about days, okay? As I said before, the only time we do business days is getting the deposit to escrow, because escrow is not open on non-business days, right? Everything else is calendar days. Tomorrow is always day one. So whatever we do today, delivery, acceptance, whatever is done today, tomorrow is going to be day one. So it doesn't matter if it's 8 in the morning or 5 in the afternoon. Today is day 0, the day we do something. Tomorrow is day 1. And then you just start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. If the last day to perform is a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, we call that the scheduled performance day. Okay. But because it's a Saturday, Sunday, or a holiday, right, you can't perform, or you don't have to perform because it's a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. So you roll over to the next business day, which presumably is Monday, unless it's a 3-day weekend, then it would be Tuesday. And that is known as the allowable performance day. Okay, so that's how that works. Well, let's say the scheduled performance day, the 17th day, is a Saturday. When do you give the notice to perform? Do you do it 2 days before the allowable performance day, which is Monday? Or do you do it on Thursday, 2 days before the scheduled performance day? You do it on Thursday. You follow, for notices, you follow the scheduled performance day. Day 7, day 17, day 5, day 3, day whatever. You follow the day. It's just that the party doesn't actually have to perform until the next business day, and that is what we call the allowable performance day. All right. Now, under K, we got something new with delivery. Okay. So you're going to get to the last page of this agreement. You, the agent, representing the buyer or the seller, are going to be able to put in your email address, which allows the other side to email documents to you. And when they email those documents to you as attachments or as a link, it's been delivered. So wait a minute, I didn't check my email today. Well, you better start checking your emails today, because under this contract, we can now email notices, documents, whatever. And as soon as I hit send, as long as I send it to the email address that you gave on the last page, it's been delivered. So you're saying, well, wait a minute, I couldn't open the link. Aha. You have 3 days to respond back to me and say, hey, I couldn't open your link. Or hey, your link stinks. All right, I don't open links. I go, okay, now I have to send it to you as an attachment. Can you deny the attachment? Nope, got to accept the attachment. That's the way it works. You have 3 days to deny the link, because sometimes links don't work, right? But you can't deny the attachment, all right? So that's going to be the new rules on delivery. So that's I, counting days, and K, deliver, delivery, or deliver. Okay, so hopefully that's going to stream things as we go through. Got my fingers crossed. All right, moving on. Paragraph 26. These are the terms and conditions of the offer. Okay. Keep in mind when we get to arbitration and liquidated damages, if one party initials, but the other party doesn't, the entire contract fails. The entire contract fails. Because one party wants it in and the other party wants it out. We don't have agreement between the parties. There is no contract. Now, if I send an offer over to you and I include liquidated damages and arbitration, and your party does not initial those, but you counter back, in paragraph 1 of the counter offer, it actually says, any paragraph requiring the initials of both parties, but only initialed by one party, that paragraph is removed. So your counter offer can save you there, okay? But if I give you an offer and I include liquidated damages or arbitration, and your seller signs, but forgets to go back and initial those 2 pages, we're not using DocuSign, we're using paper. Do we have a contract? The answer is no. Okay, and that's in paragraph 26. Paragraph 27, time is of the essence. This is the entire contract. There are no other contracts. Any changes to this contract must be done in writing, signed by all parties. Paragraph 28 talks about the legally authorized signer. So we're pulling away from that representative capacity form, because in the signature pages, we actually have the verbiage in there. So hopefully we won't have to use it. But it goes on to say that once I identify myself as the representative of the entity buying or selling the property, after that point, I can just sign my name. I don't have to repeat who I am. Okay. So moving on, now we get into page 14. And the first thing you're going to see is paragraph 29 and paragraph 31 look a little different. They got boxes around it. And that means that in order for those paragraphs to be included, both parties need to initial. One party initials, one party doesn't, no contract, got to counter it out. All right. So let's talk about liquidated damages. Okay. This paragraph says that if the buyer breaches, that means they're unable to perform after releasing all their contingencies in writing, then the buyer agrees to give up their deposit to escrow. However, if the deposit exceeds 3% of the purchase price and the buyer intends to live in the property as their personal residence, then there is a cap on the amount of deposit that goes to the seller, and that is capped at 3% of the purchase price. It is never 3% of the purchase price. It is the deposit, but not to exceed 3% of the purchase price if the buyer is going to live in the property, okay, as their personal residence. But remember, in order for this to take effect, both parties need to initial, and the buyer must not be able to perform or not perform after releasing contingencies in writing, okay? The fact that they just didn't release them, those contingencies remain, okay? The only way those contingencies go away is if the buyer releases them in writing. Mediation is a mandatory part of the contract, okay? That's why it doesn't have a box around it. So the parties agree to mediate, which means meet with a mediator and try to settle the claim. They can be represented by an attorney. They don't have to be represented by an attorney. The parties will choose their mediator. They can pick anybody they want to. There's no qualification to serve as a mediator. The C.A.R. has actually put in a mediation website to help them find a mediator. See, the mediator cannot impose a decision. It's up to the parties to decide whether they want to settle or not. And if they can't settle, then they can litigate, or they can elect to go into arbitration. Now, at the present time, we do have a blank where they can choose in advance who will be their arbitrator. C.A.R. is talking about having a toggle down menu that you can hover over and see some mediation companies like American Arbitration Association or JAMS or something like that. But the arbitrator must be an attorney or retired judge with at least 5 years of residential real estate law experience, okay? Because they will make a binding decision on the parties, and typically that decision is not appealable. They cannot appeal the decision. Okay, so you're giving your right up to appeal. You're also giving your right up for a trial, which is a fundamental constitutional right. Okay. And now we get to page 15. Okay, so we're almost done, and I'm coming right up on 3 hours, so my timing is very good today. This offer, again, good for 3 days, as we talked about earlier in paragraph 3, okay, because that is a negotiable point, so it's in paragraph 3. If you have an entity buyer, like a trust, LLC, corporation, or whatever, you would check under 32B the box entity buyer. Okay, you would identify the entity, and then under buyer signature, you would identify your role as the buyer to the entity if you are the buyer. Okay. If you have more than 2 buyers, then at the bottom there, we have the additional signature addendum. All right. Now, that removes the requirement of using that representative capacity signature disclosure, because you can identify the entity that you're signing on behalf of. The representative capacity signature disclosure was for a party who is an entity to properly identify themselves and their representative. So it would be at Estes, member, Mount Sac Limited Liability Company. So you need 3 lines for that. Okay, we didn't have 3 lines in the old agreement, but we'd have those lines here. Well, when would you use the representative capacity form, since we already tried? What if you have 2 entities? You have the Mount Sac LLC and you have the Chafee LLC. Ugh. Now you got to bring in the representative capacity addendum, okay? Because you can't fit 2 entities on this. This is only for 1 entity buyer. Likewise, for the acceptance, we only have one room for 1 entity seller. If you have 2 entities, if a property is co-owned by 2 corporations or 2 LLCs. But how often is that? Almost never. When do we typically see the representative capacity? A family trust, right? Or maybe the family LLC. And usually it's only 1. So we should be okay here, all right? With the acceptance, okay, seller can accept. Seller can use the counteroffer, either the single party counteroffer or the multiple counteroffer, or they can do an acceptance as a backup amendment. Okay, so it's a backup offer. So it's conditional on the first buyer falling out, right? And then seller sign. If seller does not want to accept, does not want to counter, be nice if the seller would initial the box on the bottom saying offer not accepted. So you can then send this back to the buyer's agent. So the buyer's agent knows that the offer was presented and rejected. Strongly recommend using this area, although it's not required, but I strongly recommend you using this when you have multiple offers. Or take it one step further. If you have multiple offers, call each of the agents up. You're representing the seller. Say to each of the agents, we are in a multiple offer situation. I plan on presenting all offers tonight. I wanted to let you know this in case you wanted to go back to your buyer and strengthen your offer. That means raise the price. And if you would like to present your offer directly to the seller and I this evening, we are accepting appointments for that. I'm going to make this offer to the other agents as well. You see, now you're giving this agent the ability to present their offer directly to your seller and yourself. That agent can never come back and say, you didn't give them a fair shake, right? Why is that important? Well, potentially sometime in the future, you're going to be writing an offer on one of their listings or a listing on somebody at their company, and you want your reputation to be good. You gave them a fair shake, they'll give you one. Don't have to do it that way, but I do recommend it. Okay, let's go into the chat and see what's going here. Okay, so question for liquidated damages. Just want to confirm about liquidated damages. Buyer will have to pay 3% of the good faith deposit, but no more. No. Buyer's deposit of whatever amount, buyer's deposit will be used as liquidated damages. Okay. However, if the buyer intends to make that their personal residence and that deposit exceeds 3% of the purchase price, which is not frequent in this area, right? Then it's capped. So let's say the buyer's deposit is 5% of the purchase price. And buyer breaches, but the buyer intends to live in the property. Only 3% of the purchase price, or the amount of the deposit not to exceed 3% of the purchase price, can be used as liquidated damages. However, if buyer was buying this house as a rental property, then it's the entire deposit. Even though it's 5%, it's the entire deposit. Why? Because buyer is not going to be living in that property as their personal residence. Okay. Do you need to give the buyer's agent the reason of why his offer was not accepted? No, you don't. And I recommend you not do that, because sometimes it will come out as appearing discriminatory. I actually had a situation with an office I managed. We had 2 offers. Okay. One was from a same-sex couple without children. The other was with a heterosexual married couple with a child. And the seller accepted the offer from the married couple with the child because it reminded them of themselves when they bought the property. And that got back to the same-sex couple. This was before we had same-sex marriages. It was kind of touch and go there for a while. We didn't know if there was going to be a lawsuit or not, because one of the members of that couple was extremely upset. The other was a little bit more conciliatory. We were able to settle things down, but it was a little touchy there. So I don't necessarily, it's kind of like if the buyer wants to cancel based on their investigation, do they need to give a reason why they're canceling? No, they don't. But it does have to relate to the investigation. In other words, if I make 3 offers on 3 different properties, I put them all in escrow, but I only intend to buy one property. I just wanted to see if I could get them all 3 in escrow and then pick which one I wanted. That's bad faith. I've got 2 sellers that could sue me for that. But if I make an offer on your listing, we go into escrow. And during escrow, I just say, no, just don't like this neighborhood. I just don't like how close we are to the freeway. I just don't like my commute. I don't like the color of the house. I can cancel. As long as it's my reason, okay? As long as I just decided this house doesn't work for me, that's good enough. Of course, the problem with sharing that with the seller, seller wants to fix it, right? Not in this market, but in other markets. So I don't recommend sharing with the seller the why, okay? Or the seller sharing with the buyer the why. Just go for it. Go for it. Will the new RIPA form? Yes. And it's going to have a grid box, just like this contract does. So the RIPA, residential income purchase agreement, the commercial property purchase agreement, the vacant land purchase agreement, the notice of default purchase agreement, those new construction purchase agreements, my understanding, they're all going to be reformatted, and they're all going to have I don't know if it's going to be paragraph 3 or not, but it's going to look like that. Yep, they're all changing. All of them are changing. There's like 6 or 9 purchase agreements, right? Not just the RPA. There's a bunch of them out there. They're all changing, which is why it's taking C.A.R. so long to do this. Okay. Okay. And the release, I guess, sometime this month. We don't know when. Laura and I were talking about it earlier. 6th, 14th, 15th, 27th. You'll know as soon as I know, right? Okay. Moving on, because we're almost done. Now, page 16. So remember I was talking about the real estate broker section, right? Notice under 5A, okay, designated electronic delivery addresses or addresses, whatever they are. And then under 5B, designated electronic delivery addresses. So again, for the seller's brokerage firm and the buyer's brokerage firm, we are put in our, I don't recommend using your text. Texts are hard to save, right? And you're supposed to save copies of everything, or your broker's supposed to save copies of everything for 3 years. That's state law, right? So I recommend using email. So you can put your email in there. And alternate, who's your alternative email? Well, that could be your transaction coordinator, right? Your TC. You can put them in there. And you can check the box if you want everything to go to your transaction coordinator. All right. So flows back and forth, right? So just make sure you put in the right email address. So go into the templates, pre-fill this form out, get it right, have a buyer's template, a seller's template, get your email in there, get your license numbers and all that stuff in there. So it's all set up. Then all you have to do is go into templates, copy that template into a new transaction for whatever deal you're putting together. All right. And then escrow acknowledgement. And then when you have a seller that won't initial the rejection a couple pages ago, you can at least initial that you did present it to the seller. Falsification of this can cause you to lose your realtor status, which means also loss of access to zip forms. Okay, so make sure you do that properly. Okay, so one thing in the chat, let's see. Thank you, Ed. Okay, I made it like almost exactly 3 hours, and that's including the 10-minute break. So I'm quite proud of myself. My phone number is here if you want to call me. Okay, I teach, so sometimes I'm in my office, sometimes I'm in the classroom, but I always respond to my emails. Just because I'm an attorney, I don't give legal advice, so please don't ask me legal advice. But I'm happy to talk about forms, about what the law is, as if I was one of your instructors. So I'm happy to do that. So please feel free to email me. Just remember, I'm not giving legal or tax advice, even though I'm an attorney in addition to being a real estate broker. Things are coming to the chats. Looks like there are thank yous. Laura, I think I did a good job, at least for these people.
You did a great job. Thank you.
And we're going to record that. This is recorded.
Yeah.
And it's going to be when do you think it's going to have it posted, Laura?
Probably by Friday.
Perfect. And if you want to see it before Friday, you can see the one that was done last month. And it was about as good as this one, maybe better. I don't know. You can grade me on the two, but they're there for you. And again, I'm a volunteer. Hope you enjoyed it. My job is to provide education. If any of you do know somebody who's thinking about getting a real estate license, encourage them to come to Mount SAC for real estate principles and practice. You're going to learn a lot more in my classroom than a home study course, I think. Hopefully you all agree with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.